Hey everybody, it's Monday, and this week's awesome person is Bruce Botnick. Hey Bruce, how are you?
Great, thank you. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for doing this. I have a feeling this is going to be a large amount of fun. Before we get into telling us stuff, you're in your studio in Ojai, is that right?
That's correct. Ojai, California, which is in between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara.
So you're up. How could you throw a rock and hit Greg Penny if he were standing outside of his studio?
Yeah,
Okay.
probably. If I had a mortar, actually,
Okay. We'll get you
that would
one.
be good.
We'll
Yeah.
get you on. Yeah, we had a great talk with Greg, and he brought up some of the stuff he's doing, which you're sort of involved in similar things. So we'll definitely get to that later on. But as I do with all these things, I try to find ways to sort of structure it so we walk through, and it's easy to do things chronologically. But your path has so many branches on it that we're probably going to be jumping all over the place a little bit. But if it's okay, I'd love to start in the total Wayback Machine, which is your parents, because they were both in the music industry. And as far as I can find out, your mom was a copyist in the LA scene, and
Music
she
copyist.
worked with Nelson Riddle quite a bit, right?
Right. That's correct.
So that's obviously huge acts that Nelson is arranging for. And did you get to go to the studio and witness some of this stuff and really see it from a very young age, or was it just that was her job and she went off to work?
Most of the time, she went off to work. Occasionally, she took me to a session. I went to a few Gordon McRae sessions. I don't know if anybody knows who he is,
I
but
have
he
to
was
admit I don't.
if you saw the movie Carousel
Right.
and Oklahoma, that was him.
Wow.
And he was amazing because I remember he used to do before every take, and this was at the old Capitol Studios on Melrose Avenue, which Richard Perry later
Oh, Studio
took over.
55. Yeah.
Studio
I worked
55,
there
which
for
I
years.
believe was built for Brunswick, and then Bing Crosby got it, and then, but they had the orchestra on a stage, and where the seats were, which were down about 4 to 6 feet, they'd put the vocalist so they could get isolation, and that's where. But he'd do handstands before doing a take for
Wow.
everyone. I was impressed. I thought, wow.
Yeah, when you're a kid, anyone who can do a handstand is super cool.
Yeah.
That's great. Wow, that's really fun. It's a very strong thread with Greg Penny as well, because I met Greg when he was making a record at Studio 55, and I was working there for a few years. And anyway, so then what did your dad do?
My father was a violist, violinist. He was in the most popular bands of the era, which were in the 20s and the 30s, just before the big band era, George Olsman. And he played all the jazz solos on the viola.
Wow.
For that, they normally in those days it was a trombonist, but he played. And he told me some great stories that when they're on the road that none of today's generation or our generation in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s with drugs could even touch what they were up to, because it was all legal then.
Right.
Pot and cocaine. And he said that he used to room with a trumpet player, and the guy was always loaded. And it'd be time to, do their show. Nobody could find him. He'd go up to the room and open the closet door, and there was the trumpet player getting loaded, and he'd just fall forward, things like that.
So, as a violist, pre-PAs, how is he getting heard above the band? That seems like just an incredibly difficult thing to do.
It was called balancing.
But still, I guess if he's soloing, it's just over the rhythm section, so they'd come down. But yeah, that's pretty impressive. That's amazing.
I don't know. It's funny. I never asked him that question.
I mean, why would you? It's just that's the way
Well,
my pea brain works.
well,
So
actually, if he was live today, I would ask him.
so I mean, you obviously had a very early introduction into it, and even into record making. So that was not an odd thing. But did you know from a very young age that that's what you wanted to do? Because from what I saw, you had your own record label recording school orchestras when you were 18. Is that right?
That's true. What happened is that my father would take me to sessions all the time. And the first one that I remember was what became Western Recorders on Sunset Boulevard.
Yeah.
Before Bill got it. And there was a proscenium stage and, audience, because these were old radio studios. So they always had the orchestra there, and then they had to control them off to the side. Well, I'd go, and I wasn't interested in what the orchestra was doing. I was interested in what was happening in the control room. And I'd go in there, and what cinched it for me was that the producer or the engineer said, "You want to call the take?" And I got to push the button and say, "Take one." And that was it.
Wow.
The glory of being in the control room and pushing the button.
And so you knew right from then that that's what you wanted to do. And how old were you at that point, you think?
Maybe 10, 11.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. And somewhere, unless it was destroyed in one of the many fires that destroys tapes, it's still there somewhere in an archive. So, wow. All right. Well, so that you caught the bug. And so, so how did you decide to be like, I mean, obviously that sounds like something that must have happened somewhat naturally, like you recorded your school orchestra and then other schools. But how did it turn into the point where you would describe it as a record label recording school orchestras? Because that's a pretty organized thing to be doing at 18.
Yeah, I was a little impetuous. Didn't know what I was doing. I had a friend who ran a hi-fi store, and he had a Burlant Concertone 1/4-inch stereo tape machine. The record electronics were separate with loudspeakers, and there was the deck.
Right.
And he had a pair of U-47s that his parents had bought him in Germany and brought back. He didn't even know what they were.
Wow.
Anyway, he got drafted into the Army, and this has to be probably 1960. And I borrowed them. They let me have it. And I used it to record the school orchestra, and somehow or another got permission to make pressings and started a company called LA Portable Recorders. We had one release, and that was it for the school. But I recorded the orchestra and the choir and made albums, sold them through the student store.
Right.
And there was a company called Researchcraft, which was a wonderful pressing plant next to Goldwyn Studios. And they had a disc surface. It was real quiet, I remember. And they agreed to, press for me. I don't know how I did it, but I did it. And that was actually my calling card to get into Liberty Records when I graduated high school.
Right. So, okay. So you were doing that in high school, and then when you graduated, you went to Liberty. Now, did you approach Liberty, or did you know somebody there, or how did that happen?
Yeah, well, it's all incestuous. My father being in the business, he played in the orchestra at Republic Pictures and the 20th Century Fox and Warner's and everywhere else. And he was close friends with, was it Cy Warnaker?
Right.
And Cy Warnaker was Lenny Warnaker's father.
Wow. Okay.
And Cy left, when he left Fox, because he was involved with the orchestra there. He started a record company with a guy named Al Bennett and Ted Keep called Liberty Records. And so my father knew I was chomping at the bit, and he talked to Cy, and Cy said, "Hey, we just built our own studio. Why don't you have him go talk to this guy, Ted Keep?"
Amazing.
and take and that. So I worked there at Liberty Records as a gopher, and I did a lot of recording for 2.5 years, and they didn't pay me a dime, but it was great. I would have paid them.
Now,
It was so fantastic.
for people who don't know, Liberty Records, among other people, had Bobby V and the Chipmunks.
And Johnny Burnett.
That's pretty good.
And Julie Christie. And, oh, God.
Now, were the Ventures on Liberty, or because it was around that time you recorded the Ventures, or was that after? Am I confusing things?
That was during and after.
Oh, okay.
At Dalton Records, which was distributed by Liberty, and they were downstairs from the studio. It was like a little compound, and it's still there. It's called ID Sound. The studio is upstairs. I have not been in there since probably 1962, 63, maybe. I don't know what it's like.
Probably got some ADATs at some point, but you never know.
Hard to know. But it was fantastic. I mean, when I went there and I started working with some young musicians who later became the Wrecking Crew, actually.
Right.
With Glenn Campbell and Leon Russell and David Gates and Jackie DeShannon. And we were doing songs, and I did a lot of them, recorded them for Hill and Range Music, publishing demos.
Oh, right. Right. So kind of like what people think of as the Nashville scene of getting a band, putting down a demo, but that's what everybody was doing at that point.
Yeah. We do 3 or 4, maybe 6, songs a day. And that's where I met Lenny, and, we go back that far.
Wow. So we should talk about the Ventures a little bit, because, I mean, for people, again, I'm going to fill in the blanks just a little bit for people who are watching this, because they're generally younger than, well, both of us, let's be honest. But so the Ventures, best known for the Hawaii Five-0 theme, but also for Wipeout, which is still...
And Telstar. Don't forget Telstar.
Yeah, and they still sound great and are just the epitome of the genre with the surf guitar. And to the point where, like, I forgot that Wipeout wasn't Dick Dale, because he's, like, known as the surf guitar guy, but he had nothing to do with that. But so now you didn't work on those 2 tracks, but let's hear just a little bit about the Ventures, because they must have been pretty hot stuff at that point.
Well, when I was already at Sunset Sound by that time, and I met this producer named Joe Saraceno, who was producing them, and Bobby V, amongst others. But I had worked with the Ventures at Elektra and became quite close to the bass player, Bob Bogle. I mean, Noki Edwards always blew me away with his dexterity and how fluid he was. I mean, they came in and they had it nailed, and they played live. There were no overdubs.
Right.
I never did one overdub with them.
Wow.
And I guess I did at Sunset Sound a couple of albums. I can't remember what they were, but I think I have them. But I love those guys. They were so much fun. We would show you how together they were. They come into the studio, and we do, in the first session from 10 to 1, we'd record side 1. From 2 to 5, we'd record side 2, edit it that night, cut the masters, and there's a cat.
Yeah, that's Squid. Squid doesn't usually make an appearance.
Yeah, and then cut the lacquer masters that night, and 2 days later, the album was on the street.
Right. Kind of like the white label hip hop days, that 30 years later, 20 years later. Amazing. So to put things in perspective, because I do want to talk about this, because you said when you were recording the school orchestra, you had a stereo tape deck and you had 2 microphones. So I'm assuming you recorded that in stereo, because of course, when we talked to Ken Scott, stereo does not exist at this point in the UK at all, really. I mean, people are not using it at all. Was stereo a standard that early, or was it still sort of an anomaly?
Oh, no. It was real, because I remember in my early high school days, first stereo records came out, and I had a crystal cartridge that I put in my system. And I'm pointing at the cat for anybody wondering.
He'll be back.
And God, I can't remember. I even had a Viking tape deck that played 7-inch reels at 7.5 IPS, staggered stereo, because in those days it was stereo, it wasn't in line.
Right.
I mean, it was, which meant that you really didn't record on it because, well, the record head was a playback head in those days as well. And I used to buy tapes, reel-to-reel staggered tapes. So, but yes, stereo, but this was mastered in mono on a full track head at Radio Recorders. I went down there and they cut the lacquer masters.
Right. Okay. Now, did you, when you were making records at that point, did you have to deliver mono and stereo masters, or were you just delivering stereo?
Are you talking about professionally or in high school?
No, professionally. Like once you're at Liberty and then on to Sunset, which we'll come back to your transition to Sunset in a minute. But I just want to get sort of the timeline of this because it's so much later in the UK.
Yeah. Well, I remember, I mean, when I went to work at Liberty, when I went to Liberty, I mean, Ted Keep, he had in the control room, it was, let me see if I think I've got a picture of the console. This, to my knowledge, is the first solid state console ever designed and built custom.
Wow.
And this was at Liberty. And it sounded pretty damn good too.
That's a lot of inputs too.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. He had 16 inputs and their knobs.
Yeah.
Which is great, you know. And it was all solid state, no valves. And he had a 4-track machine, a Presto tape machine that he had converted from 3-track to 4-track because he was doing the Chipmunks. And he had one of the first people I've ever known to variac a tape machine. And he used batteries at a variac to slow it down the right amount so that the Chipmunks, when they brought it back up to pitch.
Right.
He was really a brilliant guy. I mean, he built the first remote truck that I know of, called Mobile Recorders. And it was an 18-foot Freuhoff trailer. And he had outfitted it with a smaller version of that console and the Presto machine and 2 loudspeakers. And it was set up like a living room. It was amazing.
Right.
And we used to do lots of recording with it, remotes. So, and this was, oh God, this was between 61 and 63.
Right.
Not only were we recording at Liberty, but we were doing remotes.
Wow. Oh, amazing. Amazing. So, and then 63 is when you moved over to Sunset, right?
Right. They closed down the studio because they had been doing all their work at United Recorders and decided to turn the actual studio at Liberty into a mix room. So they obliterated the control room. I mean, they left it there, but they put a console, which really only had 3 inputs.
Right.
Because we're still mixing 3-track in those days.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, I mean, that gets back to the loudspeakers, but they turned it in. So I was on the street, and that's when I walked down the street, Sunset Boulevard, and I found Sunset Sound Recorders and just walked in and had a conversation with Tutti Camerata, who had built the place, and his assistant, Gypsy Ballou.
So Sunset, I mean, obviously an iconic studio, lots and lots of records made there. People know about the Prince records and Van Halen and obviously the Doors, which we'll talk about. But it was a really different place when you got there because you think of it as the, bands camping out there for a month and they're just working on records and you get a couple of rooms going. But it was still a factory when you got there, right?
Well, not really. It was Disney's record studio.
But I mean,
I
there
mean,
was
that's what,
lots of stuff going on. Like in a single day, it was. Did you often have a session that could book the place out for a week?
no,
Let's say no lockouts or anything.
no. The only time that happened with a piano player named Don Randy, who was part of the Wrecking Crew, is that I bless him every day for this. We wound up doing for 6 months music for Muzak, for elevators and restaurants.
Right.
Every type of music there is, from the real thing up to white man's version of it. And it was the greatest school I ever had, because that's what we did from 9 a.m. till 6 p.m. every day, 5 days a week for over 6 months.
Wow.
And that was probably one of the best schools I ever had, because that's where I got a chance to, record all different kinds of music. The interesting thing that I find today, listening to a lot of the recording today, is that a majority of it is not recorded live in a room.
Right.
And that's a sad thing, because that the performance aspect and the overall sound and the leakage from this into that and made the sounds even bigger. But we'll get into that. I'll start ranting about that a little bit.
Yeah, we can rant later. So I might be making this up, but I think someone once told me that the original United building, before it was United, was a Muzak playback center, wasn't it? Or was that next door? Maybe behind the lot. So somewhere around there, because the Muzak was all wired, of course. It's not broadcast. And they would actually, that's where the central playback for Muzak was, somewhere up there. So anyway, all in that same area. So when you got to Sunset, other than that one project, you're doing multiple sessions a day and turning stuff over, because it was also the kind of label studio for Disneyland Records, right? Which then eventually became Hollywood Records and all that. But when they started their label, that was their studio. Did they build the studio, or did they just book it out?
No. Tutti Camarata, it was his concept. He was the music director for Disney Records. Before that, he ran London Records.
Right.
I mean, and a great arranger, composer. I mean, he was like my second father. And a lot of people, a normal day for me, we didn't record at night because it was more expensive. Musicians got time and a half.
Right.
And the studio was like $35 an hour. We had 3-track and stereo and mono, 3 loudspeakers in front, which was standard in town, because you did mono, stereo, or you were recording 3-track and you put the rhythm section on one side, strings and horns and background vocals on another, and in the center, the vocal and the bass, because the thing you always wanted on your records in those days was more bass and vocal.
Right.
So that's where you go. But 99% of what we did came out as mono, and then stereo really started to hit. I mean, and I can thank Jack Holzman basically for that, but we'll get into that one. But I've lost my train of thought.
It's just like what your sort of typical day was at Sunset.
Typical day, yeah. When I started there, it was all Disney. And I was doing a lot of storytellers.
Right.
Sword and Stone, and on. And Annette Funicello. I must have done 4 or 5 albums with her.
Right.
Which was a lot of fun.
I'll bet. Yeah.
And that's where I met the Sherman Brothers, because they wrote all those songs, hits for her. But then it started to evolve, because a lot of the musicians that I was working with on those sessions put out the word. And next thing I know, I started getting commercials. And the commercials were always at 8:00 in the morning.
Right.
So the day would become commercials from like 8 to 10. reset up the studio, children, Disney from 2 to 5. And then if I was lucky, jazz and rock and roll in the evening.
Right.
And then jazz and rock and roll took over, and Disney couldn't record there anymore.
But the first, like the Doors, for instance, I mean, the first few Doors records were like that, right? They were booking evenings and coming in. And were they staying late at that point? Because again, I mean, that was a big thing with the Beatles when they broke the mold for the scheduled studio time and stayed late and things like that. But I mean, when the Doors started out, it was still that, evening session, right?
No, we would start in the afternoon a lot of the time.
Right.
I mean, the Doors and Love and Tim Buckley were all live in the studio. Very, very few overdubs until we got an 8-track machine, and then, the floodgates opened.
Right.
But it was all live. So when they came in, all I know is I had already done Love for Elektra, the first thing I ever did was Love, followed by Tim Buckley. And that's where I met Paul Rothchild for the first time. And then it was the Doors. And all I know, there was a booking, organ, piano, bass, drums, and guitar and vocal. And what really made it work for us is that Tootie had always complained about the fact that he could never get the isolation he wanted on vocals on the music he was producing. So when they built the room, and it was absolute genius, Alan Emig, who designed and built the console, later went on to Universal Audio and had a hand in designing all their tube electronics, and built the studio at Elektra, no less.
Wow.
Tootie came up with the idea of the vocal booth. And so that was an integral part of the room, which allowed me to put the lead vocalist in the booth and we could do everything live and had 100% control.
And did they have the 3 rooms then, or which rooms? Just the one closest to the street?
No.
So
Studio 1 in the back.
Studio 1, right? Okay.
Is it with the echo chamber, the great echo chamber?
Yeah.
We didn't build. Tootie, somehow or another, he bought out a studio in Las Vegas, which had a solid state console full of Longevin components. And over a weekend, we built Studio 2.
Wow.
We built the wall. We didn't know in those days about cutting the floor so there'd be no low frequency transmission and all that. And I think the first thing I did in there was Richard Perry and Captain Beefheart for Safe as Milk.
Wow.
They would pop the room. But it was, Studio 2 really didn't come into its own for a year until after I had left, actually.
Well, let's go back a little bit, because I want to hear some more about working with Love, because you worked on the first 3 records, right? Helping record the first 2 and then co-produced the third. Mm-hmm. And I've been going back today and just listening sort of to a few of the things, and those records are so, obviously Howard's just a genius and the musicianship is great, but even the production style, the way the vocals are doubled and things and go from double to harmony and stuff, but also the energy, like Little Red Book, which is the first song on, I think it's on the one you produced, right? On the first record?
No, it's on the first album.
On the first record? That's a punk song.
Yeah, I know.
It's punk, and it's 10 years ahead of its time. It's really amazing. What was it like working with them and the sort of the vibe? And did it feel like it was something that innovative when you were doing it?
Well, that's always asked, did you know at the time? I never knew at the time. But Arthur, I had the blessing of being with 2 great poets, Arthur Lee, Jim Morrison. And Arthur was like a cornucopia. It was just flowing all the time out of him. And he had this really wonderful outlook, being a black man in a white world, and he was snarky, and all the the double and triple entendres. He was terrific, but they came in as a band.
Right.
And they performed. I mean, it's all live except for a harmony vocal here and there. And in those days, we built our own 4-track. We took an Ampex 3-track, got a custom-made set of heads and a 4th electronic and a cell sync unit.
Right.
I mean, we built the cell sync unit from scratch, and so that we could do, overdub on the 4th channel and double his vocals.
Right. So it was for those records that got built.
Yeah, that album, the Tim Buckley album, the first Doors album were 4-track.
Right. Right. And those are, I mean, all 3 of those are just iconic records, arguably in very different styles and amazing and still hold up.
Well, it's all about performance too. I mean, these are basically live recordings in the studio, mm-hmm. and they have all that teenage angst. I can say that, and power. I mean, I listen to it and I'm blown away.
Yeah.
Still to this day, the energy behind it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And MC5 the same way, which we'll get to in a bit. But just the power, and I don't know, and you misremember things and you sort of think things were different than they were, but it feels like revolutionary to be that aggressive and that just out there with everything. Like there's nothing restrained at all about that Love record.
Not at all. Not at all. You got to remember, this was an incredibly productive time musically. Surf music was happening.
Yeah.
Motown was happening. I mean, radio stations in those days weren't narrowcasting like it is today, where you have just hip hop or just, adult contemporary or whatever. They played everything.
Yeah.
They would play Love, Little Red Book, into an Ella Fitzgerald song, into a novelty song, The Purple People Eater,
right.
And then go to Frank Sinatra or whatever, or How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? I mean, it was full on. Everybody heard everything.
Yeah.
And I think it was better because everybody got a taste, an understanding of what music was about and the history of music through it. Arthur's a good one. He was a big jazz fanatic, and you really hear it in his singing, especially as you get into the 3rd album, Love Forever Changes, ooh, ba, ba, ooh, ba, ba, yeah, I mean, we'll talk about Love Forever Changes.
Well, and, should we talk about it right now? Why not?
Okay. Well, when it came time to do that album, I had just finished Buffalo Springfield, and I'd become quite friendly. And all this goes back, we got to go back to Jack Nietzsche on this whole thing, because he introduced me. But that's where I met Neil Young. And we came, pretty close. We, liked what each other were doing. And I asked him at the time, I said, would you like to co-produce Love with me? And this is the album. And I think he came to a couple of rehearsals, I can't remember. And then one day he came to me and he said, I've got this fire down below that I've got to do my thing. I've got to do me. And thank you, and he went off. So we couldn't get into Sunset Sound. It wasn't available because the other engineer at Sunset, brilliant engineer, British engineer, Brian Ross Myring. Mm-hmm. Look him up. He did Sly and the Family Stone. He did The Stooges. I mean, he did so much of the Disney stuff. The guy was brilliant. I mean, he could do more with the U-47 over a set of drums, one microphone, then it would sound like he was using 5 or 6 microphones.
Wow.
I don't know how he did it, but he was brilliant. Anyway, so we wound up going over to Western Recorders Studio One. We got in there and recorded, I think over a period of 2 days, all the tracks, and recorded live vocals where I could. And I didn't know it, but Benny Goodman was down the hall recording something. And he came in and he's standing there. I looked, there was somebody standing next to me, and I went, "Oh my God, it's Benny Goodman," you know? And he's walking and listening. And he said, "That guy knows jazz." And then he left. And
That was it.
It was cool, you know, because I had heard the good thing. One of the good things about working at Sunset Sound and doing Disney is I could go to Disneyland every night,
Right.
and they always had these Dixieland nights and big band nights. I mean, I saw Basie there. I saw Benny Goodman there.
Wow.
I mean, this is in the '60s. Okay, you know, these guys were getting on in years, and there was a lot of cool things about being at Sunset.
Amazing.
But anyway, then we came back and finished the album at Sunset. I convinced Arthur that we ought to try putting some strings on it. It really lent itself, strings and horns. And went to my mother and I said, "Do you know of an arranger?" And she said, "Well, there's this young guy that we've been doing a little work for called David Angel." So I called him up and he got together with Arthur, and Arthur sang a lot of lines to him. And the result was the album.
Right.
It was, but there were a lot of sharing in those days. Nobody, because we were not narrowcasting, everybody was basically friends with one another. It wasn't unusual to be recording and Mamas and Papas would show up, or Zappa, or, you know, or Crosby would show up. You know, I mean, people were there,
Right.
just showing up and hanging. It was really cool.
Wow. That's great. It's a great record. So let's step back a little bit and just talk about Paul Rothchild, because he produced, well, the early Doors records, but also the Tim Buckley records. So did you work with him a lot, or were those kind of the only records you did work with him on?
No, we did a lot together. Did, of course, all the Doors records, except for the last one.
Yeah.
But we did Tim Buckley together. We did a group called Clear Light, who Dallas Taylor became the drummer for Crosby, Stills and Nash out of that band. I'm sure I've forgotten something else, but, you know, Paul and I started the Janis Joplin Pearl album with him and couldn't finish it because even though I was in the same union as the Columbia Records engineers, there was in their contract that all the albums had to be made by union guys.
Right.
With that local, whatever their, and I was not a signatory on that one. So I had to go away and he did that album with those guys. It came out great.
But you said you started the record?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did about 2 or 3 songs, and then they had to re-record them again because Columbia wouldn't let him use those versions.
Right.
Because it wasn't a union mixer.
Yeah, it's fun. They were really tight about that. Al Schmidt was talking about when he was a producer and would want to reach over and touch the console, and it was like Armageddon the next day about, you know,
well,
getting
used
reported.
To go yeah, it's true. I used to go visit Al when he was at RCA and when he was an engineer. And I can't remember what Axie was doing, but, you know, they had the same thing with the utility cabinets, the Altec Lansing utility cabinets with 604s, 3 of them in front with their board. And this was at the old RCA studios on the corner of Sunset and Vine. They were wonderful old radio rooms. But Al, I mean, wow.
Yeah.
Then when they built the new studios and they went down on Sunset Boulevard, I remember visiting him there and he couldn't touch the board and it kind of irked him.
Yeah.
But he had this young engineer that he was working with, a guy named John Haney. So
it worked out all right, but still, yeah. I mean,
out.
he did say that there were a lot of sessions though where he did just have to sit in the back of the room and sit on his hands, you know. which is
Yeah, it's tough.
it's a thing. So, I mean, I've seen in other interviews where you talk about where Al, Bones Howe as an influence just from listening to the records. John Palladino did all those Sinatra records. But I'm curious about producers who you call as influences, because I couldn't find anything about that. So were there albums where you really sort of separated out the production style in your own head and thought you wanted to do some things like that, just influential stuff? I mean, I know Sgt. Pepper's obviously, but just either producers you worked with who you really loved the way they made records, or just other records that you thought were sort of a template for you going forward at this time.
During that period, especially in the 60s, I wasn't conscious, and I don't mean loaded. I mean, I actually would sleep at the studio. I mean, I had no reason to go home. What for? There was a shower.
Right.
I could change of clothes. That's where I wanted to be. It was my woman. But I don't.
It's all right. I mean, you know, whatever. If anything springs to mind, because I know you're listening to music all the time, but yeah, you're also working.
Well, but I was listening
constantly
to everything.
Yeah, exactly.
At the time. I mean, when I went to school, I didn't like rock and roll at all. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand Elvis Presley. Anybody. And that wasn't, you know, it wasn't my thing. I was more interested in jazz.
Right.
And classical music. And big bands. So, you know, there wasn't a producer in particular that really influenced me until, well, Tutti Camarata, but Jack Nietzsche.
Right.
And then Tommy LaPuma. Tommy LaPuma probably had one of the biggest influences on me as far as producing is concerned. And the way the early days of the A&R man, which stood for artist and repertoire, in those days, the A&R man picked out the songs, a lot of the songs, or if it was a singer-songwriter, which is quite new in the 60s,
yeah,
picked out the songs, understood the artist, the limitations of where the artist could go, got the right arranger and put it together, and had that fire in the belly and that taste for music. And, you know, I mean, Tommy was astonishing that way. I mean, look at his canon of the artists that he produced.
Yeah. So did you make a bunch of records with him, or just listening?
No. Yeah, no, I did a lot. We did a lot together. I did most of his output at Blue Thumb Records.
Right.
We did Dan Hicks together there. I did a lot at A&M for him when he was at A&M. But he and I go all the way back to his Liberty Records days, when he was a song publisher moving into where I think he was working for Hill and Range, which was owned by Liberty, I believe. And he was moving into producing. And I can't remember how it happened, maybe through Joe Saraceno recommended me. And we came over and it was beautiful.
Right. So how did the role of producer kind of take shape when A&R was still A&R? Because, I mean, a lot of times they were running sessions as well, right? They'd be matching the song to the artist, but then also supervising sessions and hiring arrangers, as you say. So when did the producer kind of become its own thing, or was it sort of by genre? Or because it's a lot of crossover, really.
Yeah, I think that just as the music was evolving, some producers like Richard Berry became rock stars all by themselves. I mean, Paul became a rock star by himself. You know, I mean, you have as many #1 records as he had with different artists.
Yeah,
there was no fluke there, and they had a style.
And I suppose it's also when artists start writing their own material, then that version of the A&R guy doesn't mean anything anymore. So, it's a different.
Yeah, but it still existed. I mean, almost to the end, and Al Schmidt can talk to that more than I can. But as time went by and albums he was making later on, he was still the person that put the concept together and put the people together. Klaus Ogerman,
Right.
And I mean, it's just, and it was love. I mean, the funny thing is, when we started working together and we became very friendly and listening to a lot of the same music, he gave me an album, Bill Evans with Symphony Orchestra.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was like the album you wanted to take to a desert island and be trapped with, because it's gorgeous. And it really influenced Tommy greatly, and it influenced me. And because music is very emotional to me. I mean, you talk about the performances of Love, on those albums, and how vibrant they were and speaking. It's the same thing. It's an emotion. And I don't want to say that a lot of the music today is flat, but it is. It doesn't have
You might have just said that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, but I mean, I like a lot of what I'm hearing today. I like a lot of the hip hop stuff that's really beautifully recorded and done.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great.
So going back to that, to try and run a little bit chronologically, but once we get to the Doors as a subject, we'll be there for a while, and it spans 40 years.
I shoot off into outer space.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll talk about some other things first. So let's talk about Pet Sounds. Good Vibrations, because that's kind of a crazy story in a way about what has. So just, I'm not going to talk any more about that and let you talk about it.
Well, that all came about from Steve Douglas, who was the great saxophone player on Phil. What's his name? Anyway, he became an A&R man at Capitol Records, and in those days, the labels were pretty insistent about the artists recording in their studios,
right?
So they could keep tabs on what they were doing. Brian was starting to amass enough control to be able to say, I don't care what you say. I don't want to record there. So I've been doing a lot of work with Steve through Jack Nucci. And he said, why don't we go down to Sunset Sound? Young guy there, we'll get on fine. And so I did a couple of songs for Pet Sounds with the Wrecking Crew. Dennis played drums on one thing. And we did Good Vibrations. And Good Vibrations was very interesting because Brian was searching for a particular feel that he wanted and sound. And his two favorite rooms for tracking were Gold Star, Sunset Sound, and then he did all the vocals and the mixing over at Western. And I must have done the choruses and the bridge 2, possibly 3 times with Brian, with different sessions. And what he would do, he'd come in and he'd be going, he'd get the feel that he wanted. We printed the echo in those days, all that. And I'd take the 4-track, take out the other piece, literally cut it up, put the new piece in. So there was nothing left. When it was done, it was done.
Right.
And he discovered at that time the tack piano I had made.
I love this story. This is awesome.
And I developed a way, and the piano tuner thought I was mad. And the center string was in tune. The right string was up 1 cent. The left string was down 1 cent. So you got this, it was in tune, but it was wiry.
Yeah.
And Brian fell in love with it. And later, when I went to Electro Studios, I took the piano with me, and then he borrowed it. He kept renting it for other recordings that he did on the Smile album. But Brian was great. I mean, because he came in, he heard exactly what he wanted in his head, and he wanted to hear it, period. I mean, I found that out later with Jerry Goldsmith, 110-piece orchestra, and we do a big cue from the movie, and he would come in and I say, how does it feel? I said it once to him like a fool. How does it feel to hear it realized? He says, I already heard it. In his head, he says, you made it come to life, for the recording.
But so with Good Vibrations, do I have this right that piecemeal you ended up replacing the entire song? So by the time you were done, you didn't.
No.
Okay.
No,
right.
I a few years ago I participated in a video on Pet Sounds, and we had the original 4-track
right
there, tape, and I could look at it, and we were able to play it. But it was a digitized version, and I could easily hear it switch from Gold Star to me.
Right.
And then go to me to the bridge and then back down, and it was all over the place.
Yeah, and it's incredible that now everybody's so careful to try and make sure transitions are all good and things. And the fact that if you have recordings that were done like that, well, none of the effects are printed. You'll sort it out in mixing. You can smooth it all out. I mean, you're printing everything. It's mixed as you track and cut it in, basically, right?
Yeah, exactly. You have to imagine that when you're the engineer and the producer on the date, that you are one of the performers as well, and you're part of it. So whatever, and I mean, I've gone back and listened to stuff that I've done, or even gotten 4 tracks to work on, and I don't know how I did it. Literally, I can't figure. I mean, I go, wow.
But you had to know the arrangement. You had to know when solos were coming, because all that had to happen as the take went down, right?
Right. Well, because we didn't have automation, I mean, even through 8-track and 16-track, 24-track, and even 48, we didn't have automation. So you had to learn it and you had to perform it.
Yeah.
And if you were in an extended mix, you had to have all those moves in your head.
Now, when you're working on, I mean, I know this is a really special case, so I'm just trying to get my head around it. So you're working on Good Vibrations, and they're not even playing the whole song. You're just working on choruses and the bridge. Did you reference the verses you were going to be cutting into at all sonically? Or
we would cut the whole song.
Oh, right. Okay. So
with the focus on the chorus and the bridge, because he already had his verses.
Right, but I'm saying, did you listen to those verses so that sonically you'd think, oh, it'll cut together? Whatever. You just did what you did and get the razor blade out.
One of the interesting things, at least for me, at Abbey Road Studios, I was doing a movie, and I went into their shop, and they have a book. It's probably 11 by 14 or larger, and it's a Bible that everything they recorded at the end of World War II up through maybe the 80s on the stage. And on the left side is a breakdown of the microphones, the height, the azimuth, the zenith, any EQ, and what the microphone level was, the mic preamp.
Wow.
And any reverb if they did that. On the other page was the setup sheet of the stage with squares, so that they could, if they were recording an opera or symphony, they could record it over a period of time and then cut it together.
Right.
And they'd set it up exactly and use this as Godhead. And they would also notate, if I remember correctly, the time of the year they were recording, whether it was raining or not, because it always sounded different.
Yeah.
With the humidity. And I was blown away by that, because I discovered the same thing here working on various movies, that on a rainy day it sounded different.
Wow.
And I remember doing a session, and I can't remember what it was. The Wrecking Crew was on it, and it rained really heavy. And the floor in Studio One was inclined like this because it was originally a garage. And we down at the end where we right against the control room was the deep part. And that's where we always put the percussion and the brass and stuff for the rhythm. And I remember Carol Kay with her feet up on a box so she wouldn't get electrocuted because there was still water in the studio.
God. All right. We got to mention it because it's such an iconic song. So the Turtles, Happy Together. Just anything to say about that one?
Well, that's where I met Joe Wizard.
All right, that's worth talking about then.
And we did, the man from Philadelphia, we were friends for quite a few years still. He's the one that brought me into Earth, Wind and Fire and it helped get me into CBS, but we'll get that. The Turtles, he got this song, Happy Together, from, forgive me, I can't remember the writers' names. They did a lot of hits. And brought the band in, and we recorded live in the studio, the rhythm section. And then did all the vocals and did the brass. And I think Nick DeCaro did the horn arrangements for it. He was a guy that, arranger, good friend of Tommy LaPuma's, who grew up in Cleveland, Ohio together and were in bands together, came out and Tommy did a tremendous amount of work with him.
Oh, train's going by.
No, that's George Massenburg.
Tell him to wait his turn.
Did you hear that, George? Oh my God. He just told me that Jack Holzman is online now. He's listening, so I have to be careful.
Okay, good to know. Good to get a heads up that everybody knows about.
Yeah, so where was he before the train whistle went off?
We were doing overdubs, the brass arrangement on Happy Together.
Yeah, we did that with Nick DeCaro, and then we mixed. And it was the first, we did it on 8-track. It was one of the first 8-track recordings that I had done beyond the doors because I rented the very first 3M 8-track from Wally Heider. It was 001. And we brought it in and I used it on Strange Days. And that machine, it was there forever until Sunset bought a Scully 8-track. But that machine kind of has a big history because I'm jumping back and forth. So remember where we were. When it came time to do the MC5, Jack Holzman and I had flown to Ann Arbor, Michigan, heard the band. In fact, when we heard the band, it was so loud. First time I'd ever heard Marshall amplifiers. It was so loud, it was like white noise. And I had the presence of mind to bring along a cassette machine, one of those old square Sonys for dictation. And I put it on a stool and recorded, and we got back to the hotel room and found out, my God, there's songs there. So we were great. So I arranged with Wally, because he was the go-to guy for remotes, to fly his rig back to Ann Arbor. He rented a truck with a lift gate, and in the lift gate, in there were a tube Universal Audio console, 2 Altec Lansing 604Es loudspeakers and Universal cabinets, and this 8-track machine and a bunch of mics. And we had the machine on the ground because we were setting up the basic of the control room, put the machine on the lift gate, and we're raising it up, to bring it in. And Wally and I are talking to one another with our backs to the machine. And all of a sudden the truck goes, whop, and we hear this whomp. and turn around and look, and the machine fell over on its back.
God.
And he had built this really sturdy frame for it. We picked the machine up, put it up, plugged it in. It was fine. So, and I used the same machine for the LA Woman album. Rented it and took it up to the upstairs of the Doors workshop and used it up there. So it's been around for some pretty
That's amazing. So, well, is there anything else we want to say about the Turtles? Because if not, let's talk about that MC5 recording.
Well, I mean,
is
the
phenomenal.
mix was, getting back to the 8-track, what was important about that is because it was really the first time that it really got into a song and trying to, refine it, because we had separate tracks, the bass and we'd sit there and listen to the drums and the bass for an hour, and go, add the guitar, do stuff like that, which was probably the beginning of our downfall, but we did it.
But
anyway.
Also, you're not sitting in a studio with like 30 pieces of outboard gear, and I mean, it's still just balance, really, at that point, right? A little bit of EQ.
That was our tube console, 14 inputs, and we were still mixing for mono. I mean, I remember that mix. We made it mono. I cut a ref, and we went over to the Whiskey A Go-Go where the band was playing, and played it over the speakers, and I was horrified. But when it hit the radio, it was fine.
That mix is held up.
Yeah,
big time. So I sort of talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm just really curious because you did so much work in mono and so much work in stereo. Did you have a preference? Did you care? Did you feel like one of them gave you more room to do stuff, or you just, whatever, each project was a thing and you did it?
I loved mono, and I still love mono. Because you can do things with it that you can't do in stereo. And the Phantom Center, there's such a buildup, almost a false bottom. I mean, the reason I say that, because I've done so much discrete multi-track surround recording and use that center speakers that I like using it. I like putting that vocal there. I mean, I don't mind opening it up a little bit sometimes,
right?
But there's something about it. But mono was great. I mean, I had the board aligned, and this was one of the geniuses of Alan Emig, that he had devised a mono and a stereo bus, and it was a 3-track console that we added the 4th bus, where you could listen in mono and you were printing a stereo, and your stereo was perfectly balanced.
Right.
So a lot of times we would listen in mono. I mean, we were still making singles for AM radio. So mono was still.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Yeah. That's how people got a lot of their music.
Yeah, and the perspectives that you could achieve in mono were different. And we had to learn how in stereo, how to achieve the depth and presence and, where things are. Where in mono, you could do it and then feature and, I'm not saying that everything in mono was great, but a lot of the great recordings were that way.
Right, that's really interesting. So you're basically saying that because it's a single source, you have complete control over what the listener's experience is, as opposed to once you split it out, you can kind of shift your attention in places that maybe you're not wanting the listener to do it.
Well, I mean, I know a lot of guys and gals these days, or even then, when we were doing stereo, and I still will do it. I'll open the door here in my control and go outside and listen to the mix.
Yeah.
Because it's not points. I mean, it's just singular.
Yeah.
And like having surround and home, to me, is overkill, because I want to be able to sit over to the side or on the floor or whatever, and I don't want to have to sit in the middle to get the balance. I mean, I listen here today doing Atmos and Sony 360 and surround for my films and doing Atmos. And it's really, at the listening point of the listener.
Right.
And the focus. Whereas if you're mono, you can be anywhere.
So, but when you say
I'm going to
that,
get a lot of flack on that one. I'm
no,
sure.
not at all. Look, I completely look. How many people's houses did I go to in like the 70s and 80s where they had a stereo, but one speaker was in the kitchen and one was in the living room? And you'd hear a Beatles record and like, what the hell is going on? You
Oh,
know?
well,
So
those were
absolutely.
great.
But when you're talking about, when you say that there are things you can do in mono that you cannot do in stereo, I'm just curious, like, what are those things for you as a producer and a record maker that what are the big, I mean, obviously you've got the listener position and things like that, but in terms of like doing stuff, what are some of the things you really feel like you can do in mono that you can't do in stereo?
Creating different dimensions with reverbs and delays.
Right, and you don't think that translates out as well. That's really interesting.
Well, no, it's a whole different mindset.
Right.
Because now I find that when I do something that's immersive, that when I collapse it down to mono, it doesn't always, I'm not getting the same dimension that I want.
Right.
And a lot of times if I'm doing something for mono, I listen in mono. I don't want to be open it up and go, woo.
Right.
I mean, it goes back even to the early days of the Dolby Matrix, LTRT.
Yeah.
Left track, right track, which gave us basically surround. And we wound up in those days listening through it.
Right.
So you knew what it did. And then when you got on the dubbing stage, occasionally I say, turn off the matrix. Let's see what it sounds like discrete. And it was like, oh my God, really spread out. But anyway, that's another.
Right. No, it's all really fascinating though, because I think there's so many records, and the Beatles is the easy way to go because they were made in mono, but then they had to be stereo versions for the States, et cetera, et cetera. So, but there is so many records made for mono, and while you're making a record, you're making all your decisions based on what you hear while you make the record. So it's hard to say that every recording should be able to translate to every listening environment. Like, that's ridiculous in a way, because things can be built to go together. So, but
this goes back to what I was saying about the recording a 3-track where you had the vocal with the bass, but this was for making a mono.
Right, exactly. Just to give you enough control later on if you needed it, but it was all going to go together anyway. So, right. Okay, just because we could go down that rabbit hole for another hour, but we got to talk about MC5. So,
okay, but before we do that, I
yes.
just want to say something. A lot of the recordings I'm hearing today are basically big monos.
Mm-hmm.
There's no, you don't hear any leakage, you don't hear any movement, any placement, any dimension. They're big monos, and I understand it. But I think it's sort of like when I was teaching at USC, I was astonished because it was all MP3 generation.
Right.
They didn't know about other kinds of sounds. And for you out there that don't know about these things, they didn't know about records either.
Right.
Literally. Now a lot of people do. And of course the hip hop guys knew about it. So it's odd.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of modern record production, and it's almost weird saying out loud, because like Bruce Botnick recorded absolutely everything in stereo, and he made some of the most incredible sounding records with placement and things. But the problem is that every single source in modern production is stereo. Even kick drums, you'll get stereo kick drum samples, stereo. So everything is just spread out across the whole field, and you don't have these little pinpoint ways to build up the track.
Right.
So I guess, I mean, it's just dual speaker mono in a way. So they're listening to you, basically. So,
I mean, we won't get into compression and limiting.
No, look, we'll get questions about it at the end. But I one of the things I like is we don't have to get into that unless you want to. We can, we could do nothing but talk about compression and limiting. But but before we do compression and limiting, we've got to talk about that live MC5 record. Because what I'd love to know is, first of all, just how the genesis of that project, because like you say, you traveled up there to hear them and you didn't even know what they had, but how that turned into a live recording, because that's actually kind of a theme on a lot of your records, is going where the artist wants to be, or in a situation where you're going to get the best performance, and you're the engineer, but whatever, you'll go and do it where it needs to be done. So I'd love to hear some more about that, because it's a phenomenal sounding live thing, and it's so exciting.
It's really interesting. When I heard the band, both Jack and I agreed it had to be live. I mean, I found that out later when we tried to go into the studio and just couldn't get that electricity.
Right.
Well, let's do another take. Oh, I don't want to play that one anymore, But I've lately opened up the multi-track, the 8-track, and put it in an Atmos mode, because I had room mics,
right,
picked it up, and through a little trickery, I can make it hit other spots, and really, so you feel like you're in the Grandy Ballroom, and it's so much more powerful. And it's just, it blows my mind that we did it. We did it all in one night. And the opening act was the Stooges.
Of course.
And we didn't record them. I don't know why. I don't know why.
Tape was expensive,
But I love that band. I still am close to Wayne Kramer.
Right.
And Saturday on the 4th, I have an MC5 t-shirt still that's an American flag in the MC5. That was my political discourse.
Nice.
On the holiday.
Well, and that's another record like the Love records that could come out today, and you wouldn't say, oh no, that's an older thing. And it was something interesting that I read, which may or may not be true, but you attributed it to Paul Rothchild, which is one thing that he hated, was anything that would be a timestamp while making a record. He didn't want you to say, though, this is a 60s record, a 70s record. And that seems to have, either you are already feeling that way, but it's definitely kind of a hallmark of your work. Like, the bands are of a time, because the writing it could be influenced in a certain way, but there's nothing sonically that's like, oh, this is the gimmicky thing for now and doesn't hold up.
I can address that. His position was, and I think he was totally correct, maybe at the time, it's since evolved. He didn't like any foot pedals, any fuzz tones, anything like that wasn't organic. He didn't want to be using something that everybody else was using. He wanted the band to have their own identity. And what a good case in point is on When the Music's Over, Robbie's guitar solo. Well, if you'll notice, it's quite distorted. Robbie didn't make that sound. I did, because I took the microphone, brought it in to a mic preamp, out of that mic preamp into another mic preamp, and then increased the first one until the vacuum tubes really were glowing purple, and we heard the quality of fuzz that we wanted, and that was it. So that was unique.
So he was okay with distortion, but not like, you don't get to just like pop your pedal down on the floor and do it. It was going to be part of the recording process.
That's correct. That's correct.
So what was his take on things like the Hendrix records, where obviously that stuff is going on in the amps and things? I'm just curious, did he not really like that stuff, or it just wasn't what he was doing?
It wasn't what he was doing. He liked Hendrix. I saw Hendrix perform live at in Hollywood, and it was, I didn't have a problem with those devices because they were new.
Yeah.
And we were into almost anything new.
But then you obviously just have impeccable taste to not choose the new stuff that's going to go away and date the song, because there's very, like, even the vocal effects on is it On Strange Days? Yeah, On Strange Days, the crazy filtered delay effects and things. I mean, that you probably could have found an effect that would date the record, but that is awesome, and you'd want to do that today, you know?
It was done using a Moog. It was the first time I'd ever seen one. We brought it in, and we found this sound, and Jim actually played it on the keyboard every time. Strange Days.
And he's opening up the filter with his vocal going through?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was part of the mix, because when I went back to remix for surround and new mixes and everything, it's not printed. It's only on the stereo and the mono. And I had to recreate it. And I got pretty close to it using envelope follower and, a couple of things in the mix.
Right.
But that was pretty unique.
And what's amazing about it to me is it's not quiet. I mean, it's up there in the mix, but you could get through the whole song and not know it's there. But then when you go listening for it, it's a gigantic part of the way the song plays for you. But it doesn't step on anything. It's kind of genius the way that is. And I think part of it's the filtering, but it's also the balance of it and the way everything else is around it. It's got so much space to be this crazy thing, even in a dense track, that it's great. Really great.
And it's also, again, making a decision live.
Right.
And living with it.
Right. Well, and especially while printing the mix. I mean, that's not as bad as having the guitar solo happen during the mix, but it's close,
Let me ask you something. This is my favorite thing to ask other mixers. When you've done a song and you're exhausted, you made a rough mix. How many of those rough mixes have wound up to be masters?
Not as many as probably should be, because I usually, if I'm tracking, I'm also producing, and then I know I'm going to mix, and I make a really concerted effort to do absolutely nothing while I'm tracking. So it's just faders up. There's nothing going on. So obviously I'll track with effects and I'll crush things, but I kind of know there is a mixing process yet to come. But I think it's probably just because I'm a bit younger. But definitely getting the feel of the rough mix back is always a struggle. Like, I'll beat it sonically in 5 seconds, but it won't feel as good for a really long time.
Yeah. I mean, I had a #1 record that way, and it was a mix to a cassette, no less. I could never beat it.
Yeah. Yeah, and there are examples of that all through recording history. And I think it's a testament to realizing that that's what you got to beat. It isn't the sonics, You have
to be dead tired.
Yeah.
Not conscious.
So, all right, we've already touched on the Doors. We're going to get back to the Doors because we'll take them sort of start to finish in a second. But you worked on Let It Bleed. So we got to talk about the Stones. I mean, just because it's the Stones and it's Let It Bleed.
It was through David Anderley, who was a West Coast head of A&R, and had run Brother Records for the Beach Boys before coming to Elektra. He was very close friends with Glenn Johns. And the Stones were coming in to do I think it was their first road trip in quite a while, in 1969. So they came to Elektra Studios on La Cienega. Glenn was there. He engineered the whole thing. I was the second engineer, and helped them put we put a stereo microphone out on La Cienega so that Mick could hit the horn of a car, for the opening of Country Funk, Honky Tonk Funk, and things like that. And had a wonderful conversation with Keith when he told me that where American rock and roll came from, because he's a musicologist.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty cool guy.
So what was it, how different was Glyn as a producer engineer than the people you'd been working with? Was it like, no, it's another session, couple different techniques, or was it a wildly different thing at that point?
No, I was a big fan of Glenn's, and I still am. I mean, we're very friendly with one another, keep in touch. And of course, his brother, Andy, was an engineer for me a couple times. When I decided that I couldn't sit at the console and work with people that needed full attention at the same time. But Glenn was, and I wanted to see his techniques.
Yeah.
And what he was doing. I mean, he came from the same school I did. I mean, I've known Glenn since before that, when Tommy LaPuma and I went to London to finish up an album, and went to what was the studio that he was at? Olympic Studios, and he was playing us some stuff before we did it, or did our overdubs. So I was really, whatever he needed, I wanted to help him with.
Right.
One of the few times I was a second engineer for somebody else.
Well, yeah, and especially because that's, 6 years after you had already been at Sunset, and so it's not like you were just starting out of Liberty at that point. You'd been doing it for a while.
I think after a while, you leave your egos at the door, and it happens a long time before that.
Yeah.
Because what we do is collaborative, and it's an exchange of ideas and emotions, and so you can't keep it like this.
Yeah. So, all right, let's go, because we got so much stuff to cover still, and things that aren't even about records for specifically. But so let's just do the Doors, and it can be sort of as much or as little. We've touched on a lot of it. The fact that that you were the engineer from the beginning, but then you produced L.A. Woman. But just as much or as little as you want to talk about, because obviously then post Jim, you didn't work on the records that the Doors put out at that point, but you've been working on their catalog now for 30 something years since those records, right? So
has it been that long?
No, it's been like 4 months, 5 months.
And I have
tops.
I have the good luck of working with dead people.
Well,
they don't give me any shit,
Yeah, I see the way my life goes. I'd still get mixed notes from them.
Yeah. Well, every once in a while, I'll do something. I'll turn around and I'll go, Ray, is that okay? Or with this guy over here, that where is he? There he is.
Robbie.
I'll turn to him and I'll say, hey, how was the mix? And I have the ability to push a button and he'll come out and say more bass, something like
more bass. Well, that's never wrong. That's never wrong.
So, but anyway, yeah, I mean, all my studio experiences with them were varied. I mean, I just finished 50th anniversary box set of Morrison Hotel, and one entire disc comprises of 2 songs, Queen of the Highway and Roadhouse Blues, and it's basically outtakes with a lot of studio chatter.
Right.
And it's really, really fascinating to hear how much Jim had to say about the direction and how things needed to be. And especially when he talks about Blue Sunday out of Peace Frog, and he's instructing the band how to go into it. And I had forgotten about all that. I mean, it was, I was younger then, and it's, I think people are going to really like the disc because it's got a lot of cool stuff in it. And you can see how Paul and the band are separating.
Right.
Getting away from one another because Paul's getting tired of it. Because he had felt after a while, because of the Soft Parade, that he had to save the band, and he was the one who would be the A&R man now.
Right.
This is the songs you'll be doing. This is how you'll be doing them. Take another take, another take, another take, another. He got into perfection, rather than performance. I mean, it happens to us all, but it did. And you can really hear that. And there's some stuff I left off because I just felt it was unnecessary,
Right.
To bring that up. But it's really fascinating. And the next one will be the LA Woman with a lot of outtakes. And that's pretty cool. But you can really hear Jim's involvement. I didn't realize at the time how much.
So was Jim another one who heard the finished record in his head, or he just knew what he needed to feel to be able to sing what he was going to sing?
Well, yeah, I'm sure you've heard the story, and I know Ray told it, that originally when they were going to school, they wound up at the beach one day at Santa Monica, and Jim sang Ray 22 finished songs. Done.
Wow.
And that's when they decided to put a band together and do the arrangements, bring John Densmore in, bring Robbie Krieger in. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Very infrequently was a song created in the studio.
Right.
Hardly ever. There were times when they came in the studio and were rehearsed because they were used to being on the road. And when they're on the road, you can't work up new songs. It's not like the old days of being in your, the early days of writing when he had 22 songs. It was getting a little dry.
Yeah, you had a sound check,
Bobby
and that was it.
Up and started doing more, yeah. So that was kind of what was happening. So it was like they didn't really want to be there anymore. They didn't want to be told anymore. I don't want to do another take. What was wrong with that? Can't we just do the intro and cut it on? Things like that.
So were all of the records up to LA Woman made at Sunset?
No.
No. Okay.
No. The first two were The Doors and Strange Days. And then we did Unknown Soldier in Studio 2 at Sunset. And I think one other, I'm not sure. And then everything else was at TTG, which was a studio on the corner of Sunset and Highland, which had a Stan's Drive-In on the corner next to it with great car hops.
Wow. Okay, guys, I know that corner, and it's not there now.
No, and downstairs was the studio, which was called Conway Recorders at the time. It was a precursor to,
right,
built by a fellow Englishman of Phil Yend, who was Brian's mate. And they used to ride motorcycles together.
Wow.
And it was an 8-track room with a 4-track console. It was originally built by Radio Recorders. They had built the studio upstairs, which was Studio 10 each. So the whole facility got updated by Ami Hadani and designed the record plant. Famous acoustician. I'll think of his name in a moment. And that's where Frank Zappa did all the Mother's Invention recordings up there. Did a lot of Ella Fitzgerald up there, a lot of Irv and MGM, records of those days. But anyway, so we recorded the rest of the album there and mixed it upstairs.
Right.
I mean, I used to go up there and watch Bones Howe do jazz albums for Liberty Records.
Right. So when, we can talk about early records if you want, but obviously LA Woman it's kind of a big deal. So up to you if you want to, if there's anything in particular about the whole catalog up to then.
Questions.
Well,
I'll try to remember.
So you'd obviously worked with him a bunch. Was it just like an obvious thing that when Paul left, you were going to produce this record, or did they talk about other producers, or how did it come about that you were going to produce it?
It's an interesting story, and I totally understand it. Paul had just finished making Janis Joplin's album, Pearl. And he and Janis were in love with one another. I mean, seriously in love with one another. And he realized if he was going to get an album, they couldn't get it on. So he said to her, even during I think it might have been one of the sessions that I did, he said, Pearl, we love one another, but we can't do anything. I'm going to have to fuck on tape. It's just one of the great producer lines of all time.
That is a very fine producer line.
Yeah. And so when she died, I mean, he was just destroyed.
Yeah.
And then he went to the rehearsals for the LA Woman. Remember Jerry Scheps? And the band was totally uninterested. They didn't want to know. They didn't want to go through Soft Parade and Morrison Hotel again. They didn't feel that they needed to be told anymore what to do. They knew what to do. And he's sitting there and listening to Riders on the Storm and going, that's fucking cocktail jazz. I mean, it sucks. I'm out of here. He says, I can't do this anymore. He says, you produce them. You'll make $250,000. Good luck. And we went to dinner. All of us went to Muling, a Chinese restaurant down the street, and hugged one another, hugged and kissed. And then we went back to Sunset Sound, and the guy said, what do we do? What do we do? And I said, where do you feel most comfortable? They said, our rehearsal room. I said, great. I'll get some remote gear and we'll go there and do it. And that's how it happened.
Right.
About 2 weeks later, we recorded the album in, I think it was about 5.5 days.
Wow.
Like we did. The first album took us 3.5 days to record.
Right. Because they were just ready.
Yeah. And it was lovely because I found, going back to all the 8 tracks, that some songs, first, second take.
Right.
And bringing Jerry Scheps in, Elvis bass player, which Jim absolutely loved.
So let's talk about that just in a general thing with that band, how the bass player on the records thing worked, because it's kind of a big deal on the records. I mean, there's no attempt to make it sound like a keyboard bass. It's a bass. But obviously that's not the characteristic of the band when you'd go see them live. So how did that come about, and how did they all feel about it? Was that something they wanted to do? They wanted a bass player in there? It was like that was always going to happen, but they had no interest in taking a bass player like into the band.
Yes and no. They never did it live. I mean, I can say at the end, had Jim come back, that I just told you to remember his name for me. Yeah. He would have been part of the band. They asked him.
Right.
But we always had a live bass player, second album on. It was Doug Luban. He did the second and the third album. He did a little bit of the fourth, and Harvey Brooks did all of that, Soft Parade, and he did some of Morrison Hotel, and then because I was recording Lonnie Mack at the time, who I love, and he played bass on Roadhouse Blues. He brought that one night stand Chitlin circuit feel
right
to it, with Black Beauties,
And are they writing their own bass lines, or this is always raise left hand, check out what he's doing, this is what you're going to do? Because it's a really, this is a kind of a ridiculous story, but we had a next door neighbor in LA, and every New Year's Eve, he'd get super drunk and he'd crank the doors. But of course, all we could hear was the bass, because it's one house away. And it's like listening to Montuno. It's left-hand Latin piano bass. It really is.
Well, Ray used to refer to his left hand as lefty. and I always used to say, it's like you sliced yourself in half. There's this guy, and there's this guy. And I was talking with James Newton Howard about this on Saturday, that the way that Ray was literally able to separate himself. It's really hard to do. I mean, piano players are used to doing stride and, and doing this, but to literally cut yourself in half was extraordinary. I mean, Ray was really unique. And a lot of the times the bass players had to emulate Ray's left hand.
Right.
When we did, I think in Morrison Hotel, it started to really lighten up when Harvey came in. And especially when Jerry Sheff came in.
And so would Ray play as well with his left hand, or because he's so used to doing that? I mean, I can't imagine he'd want both hands to play keyboard parts at that point, because that's not what he was doing. But how did that work?
I don't know, because when he used to play just piano, 10 fingers.
Yeah.
It didn't work like a normal piano player for some reason. It was always that.
Right. Completely independent, even when he's on one instrument.
It was still the struggle to get that guy to be with this guy, I think.
Wow.
But he did it. But I mean, he is, he's not like a lot of piano players I know, but he loved jazz. Absolutely loved jazz.
Right. Yeah, it's amazing because it's especially with some of the tones, and like on I can't remember which song, but one of the songs has like almost a Motown bass sound on it.
Strangely.
So we should talk about Motown too, because we got to go there. Should we just like come back to the Doors about 60 more times while we talk about other stuff?
Sure.
Okay, let's talk about the Motown stuff, because I mean we touched on it, but you did tracking for the Supremes and for Marvin Gaye, and I'm assuming a bunch of other Motown artists. So where was that, and why did that happen? And
well, we can do it. We can talk about it now because it's okay. But these were non-union dates, and they used to pay the musicians cash.
All right, okay.
And so they get in. I remember Sharkey Hall. I don't know his first name, drummer. So freaking good. I mean, he was just, what a wonderful sound. And he'd come in and his cymbals were polished. I mean, you could see your teeth in them. They were so clear. And I built a drum platform that was floating so we could put the drums on, because I had heard that that's what they had in Detroit. So I never did any of the vocals, but I would do lots of tracks. They would come in, I wouldn't know who it's for, and they would go off to Detroit. And it came back, my stuff came back sounding like what they did. Those guys were geniuses back there.
Well, and you tried to visit the studio once, didn't you?
Yeah, I tried to go, and they wouldn't let me in. So they had it was the Motown sign. It was very secret.
But so that's got to have come out now. I mean, it's got to be the people. I mean, I'm sure that's obviously they built some of their own gear, some of those EQs and things like that. But they just had some geniuses working in that building, basically.
They got amazing sounds. I remember I did a sound-alike of, was it who did My Girl? Was it the Temptations?
I think so. I'm going to say yes. And, who's going to check?
Well, anyway, I did a sound-alike for the movie My Girl. And I got Jeff Beccaro to play drums. Mm-hmm. And I realized that we're going to have to work on the drum sound a long time to get close to what they did in Detroit. So I decided to play him the original. He would play along with it until we got it nailed, and without any other musicians, and then overdub the bass and the guitars and everything. Because to get that drum sound, I couldn't get it couldn't spend the time.
Right.
I didn't have the budget. So, I mean, through one U-47, about 10 feet from the drums, Western Recorders Studio 3, an inordinate amount of compression using a Universal Audio 1176 and an LA2. I mean, the meters were just flattened to get that kind of crunch and detuning the drums so we could match it. I mean, I know those guys didn't do that back in Detroit, but they were geniuses at whatever they did.
And that's what it took. And that's with a great drummer who knew exactly what he was trying to get out of the kit too. So
yeah. I mean, it was basically just a snare drum and a kick and a hi-hat.
Yeah. Amazing.
Like it wound up to be.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you were doing the tracking for the Motown dates, it would come back sounding just not even like what you'd sent out? Like they just Motowned it somehow? Or were you really going for that sound?
I mean, I did a Christmas album with the Supremes. I knew that I did that. And when it got back, I was astonished. I mean, I knew it was my tracks, because I remembered the arrangements. But I could never get out of them what they did to it. And he said, well, it's a secret. It's what we do. I went, okay.
It's so funny. It's so funny. Wow. Well, someday we'll know all of it. God, there's so much more stuff because you're a staff producer at Columbia for a bit. Weather Report. We talk about Weather Report. I mean, come on. Should we talk about Weather Report?
I love Joe Zawinul and Wayne Shorter and Idugu. I mean, that was one of the great experiences of my life. And I remember we did it at Wally Heider Studios on Yucca, I think Yucca and Argyle, and where the Crusaders did a lot of recording, a lot of Crosby, Stills, Nash did a lot of their stuff there, Bill Howerson. And it was a period where Joe was really experimenting a lot. And there was a lot of air to their sound, what they were doing. It wasn't like later on where it got really, funk.
Right.
There's very little funk on that album. It's just out and inventive jazz. And then terrific experience. I remember somebody who I'll leave nameless said to me, "Oh, you're doing them." Well, somebody had to do them. I don't want to do them. And I was like, you got to be kidding, man. This is one of the highlights of my life.
Just to get in a room with those guys. Amazing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Joe was amazing. Wayne, what a sweetheart. What a great musician. And we wound up, I took it to Capitol and mixed it on the Quad 8 console there before it left and pumped a little bit into the room and brought it back and used those chambers. And it sounds great. I've done some 384 32-bit transfers because I have some 30 IPS outmixes that I did of it, and it's just shocking. I mean, I don't know how I got it to sound that hi-fi. It's my hi-fi demo reel.
It's astounding. It's great. And I think someone like Wayne Shorter, I mean, obviously he gets a lot of credit, but no matter how much credit he gets, he's still underrated. It's insane what he's been a part of and a major part of, and the kind of the breadth of what he's done. And as an arranger, everything, a writer. Yeah, really incredible. Okay, so you can at any point just say, hey, we didn't talk about something, but let's move forward and because we got to go into Filmland, because that's been a big part of what you've done as well. But before we get there, we better talk about Eddie Money or people are going to get mad. So,
okay.
So
that happen?
Let's just go there. Now he made at least one of those records at Sunset? Do I have that right? Oh, he didn't, because he's made a record at Sunset, but I guess it wasn't.
No, I brought him into Sunset to sing one of the lines on "I'm All Right" with Kenny Loggins' album song that I was producing.
Okay, all right.
But I only brought him in because I had already produced an album with him, and he was amenable. And he was a great artist. I mean, he was just in love with the thought of being a rock and roll star.
Right.
and put together a great band. But his guitarist, Jimmy Lyon, is amazing. He was a great arranger, and they were very close, and they worked it out together. And that was an artist that was given to me by an A&R manager, Ellen Bernstein, at Columbia Records. And I went to meet with Eddie, and all he could talk about was Led Zeppelin. And the album he was talking about was Glenn John's brother.
Right.
And so I contacted him and told him about this album. Well, you want to do it? And Andy was a true rock and roll engineer.
Yeah.
I've never met anybody else since like him. He played stuff louder than I've ever heard it in the studio. And he had the way of doing live limiting that only the British could do, that I'd never heard before. And he made it sound great. I mean, I would watch him in amazement because he was doing stuff with an 1176 that I had never seen before, and not killing it and getting it to pump. It was amazing.
Wow.
And those sessions were live in the studio. We did them live. Very few overdubs. And they were a lot of fun. I mean, we celebrated Andy's birthday. Andy was really, he was out of control, but in a very sweet and wonderful way.
Right.
In the studio. And got an astonishing sound. Right.
And quickly too, right? I mean, not laboring over it. You're not spending a day getting drum sounds and things.
I mean, he had done a lot of recording. We were the old Studio C at the record plant on 3rd Street, the original room, which was a great room because it had a stage with a marble floor on it. So you could put the drums up there, and he take a pair of U87s and put them 10 feet behind the drums and compress the shit out of them, and then bring the presence microphones into it and get this big sound like he did with Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
Same kind of thing. And then we had the band, 3 feet down on the floor. And it was a great room, great time.
I think it's a recurring theme is the certain musicians up on stages and other musicians in front. And it's actually just for a thing. Like, you want to set up like a live band in the studio. If you're all on the same level, everybody's got cymbals. Put the drums up on a stage, the cymbals are going to shoot over the top, and you can probably get a lot better separation.
We virtually had no leakage.
Amazing.
And we had no baffles around the drums.
Right.
I mean, when I used to record at Sunset Sound, I had some baffles made, but they were so thin, I don't think they were really doing anything. And we were used to leakage. Leakage was our friend. I always like to tell that to people. Leakage is your friend. It's what made a lot of drum sounds possible of the leakage into an acoustic guitar mic.
Right.
Or a vocal to get that you just couldn't get any other way. So, I liked all that. So Andy was definitely in that school of leakage and utilizing it with compression to make it. I mean, I learned a lot from him.
And the leakage works when you commit as you get it because you know it's going to work. If you want to have all that control after the fact, that's when the leakage could be an issue. So it goes back to the, putting stuff together, committing to stuff, balancing. It's all.
Yeah, make a decision and live with it.
Yeah.
Because it's a moment in time that you're capturing, you're not, it's like a photograph. Excuse me for kicking that.
That's all right. Yeah. Well, it's also the idea that it's not like you're going to make it perfect later. you're just going to make it different later. So you'll work around, if there is a real limitation to what you've done, you'll just build everything else around it so that it works. It's not a...
Well, it's hard to reconstruct something after the fact, to go back to that moment in time.
Yeah.
It's like, I asked you about doing any rough mixes at the end of a session. The master. It's just, there it is.
It's true. Because, I mean, it's the kind of thing where even if it's just about balance, you can never seem to get the same balance again. It just never happens. Whereas that, not even thinking about it, faders up, it all plays. That's it is a moment. And it's probably the humidity's changing. I already talked about that. So, look, there are 1,000 other records that we can and probably will talk about some of, but I really do want to move into the film part of your career, because you've had as successful and as extensive a career working on film scores as you would need to have for that to be your entire career. And obviously a lot of it is with one composer, but there's also a little piece of how, from what I could piece together, sort of how you moved into that is you were a very early proponent of digital recording, like very, very early, and started a digital editing studio when that, like editing digital, people who've worked on computers don't understand that you couldn't edit most digital tape. And when you finally could, because it had analog guide tracks and you could splice without causing a huge pop, that was a big, big deal. But you didn't used to be able to edit at all. So you're a big early proponent of that. And from what I can tell, that's actually what led you into the Star Trek movie, which led you to Jerry Goldsmith, or am I connecting too many dots there?
No, you're right.
So,
yeah, they
in your own words,
Columbia Records or CBS, especially CBS Labs, were very much into digital, figuring it out. And I had seen an article somewhere, and I convinced Don Ellis, who was the head of A&R, to buy me the rig, get me a 1600 and 2 BVU.
So this is stereo onto video decks.
200s that you could use time code. So he thought, we just plunked down $500,000 for the rights for the Star Trek, the motion picture score, and you be the producer. And you're putting this gear on it, maybe we can do something interesting.
And this is 89? Something like that?
No, 79.
79, sorry, yeah. So super early.
So I met Jerry at his home. I just come from Hawaii, and I had a ponytail that went down 3/4 of my back, and just gotten back from Hawaii, and I went and met him, and we hit it off. And I told him I had all this gear, and he was an early proponent of synthesizers. He had ARP 2600, all kinds of stuff. He loved sounds. And we talked about the film and wound up over at 20th Century Fox, and I brought the gear over to record a live stereo mix for the album. About a third of the way into the recording, the Musicians Union got involved and went to Lionel Newman, who was the head of music at Fox, and said, you can't have this. We've had complaints from the musicians that you have this digital equipment that's going to sample us and put us out of business. Now, little did they know that 30 years later, that's absolutely true.
Right, but you didn't have them playing whole notes.
Well, you couldn't sample them.
Exactly.
You couldn't do it. So I was recording a stereo mix of the soundtrack. So I had to switch over to a Teldec noise reduction system on 2-track and get the rest of the score.
And were you engineering at this point, or you're just capturing the stereo?
No, I was producing. And I could have been a heavy with them because I was representing CBS. I mean, we paid the money to actually record the score.
Right.
They didn't. And because it wasn't worth it. And the score came out great. But it was the first score that I know of that was recorded digitally.
Right.
And so came time to edit it and put on an album. Now here's the thing that's really interesting. We were recording right up to almost the last day of November. The film was to open on December the 7th, Pearl Harbor Day, at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. We had to have 500,000 album pressings.
Now it'll take you 6 months to get 1,000.
5 days to get this all done. And I had gone to the AS convention and seen a prototype digital editor from Sony. I told them what we had done, and they agreed to let me have the editor. And I brought it back, set it up in my office at Columbia Records. And Jerry Goldsmith and I, and a bottle of vodka, spent about 12, 14 hours in my office and edited it all together. Doing crossfades, levels, everything. In the digital domain. I mean, it was crazy. And I have that editor, not that particular, but I have an original Sony digital editor here. Then Jerry changed his mind. He wanted to change the sequence. So I took the master, put it on the slave, and had a new master tape on the other machine. Got through the first cue, got to the second and kept aborting. Wouldn't make the edit. And Curtis Chan, who was with Sony, we arranged to get lots of computer chips and changed all the chips in the computer of the editor. And still couldn't do the edit. And I had to be with Wally Traugott in Traugott at Capitol Records to cut the lacquers. And Traugott means trust in God in German. So I had told myself, well, I'm screwed. I'm going to have to transfer it to analog, Dolby, resequence it, and cut off of that. I took the gear, the digital gear with me to Capitol. I'm walking down the hall. I'd gone to dinner with my wife at Musso Frank in Hollywood, and my life was over. You know, they talk about people hanging by a thread. Somebody cut it, you're dead. That was it. I'm walking down the hall towards Wally's room, and a very large gentleman comes up to me and he says, "You don't know me. I work here in the shop. My wife is a psychic." She says, "You're working with a new piece of equipment and she thinks she may be able to help you." I went, "Really?"
So take anything right now.
Threw the gear back in the car, went over back to Columbia, set it up, and we got on speakerphone, and he touched each piece of equipment, and she said, "Yeah, everything's okay. I'm not getting any negative vibes." And I'm just sitting there going, like, okay. She said, "Make the edit again." So I go make the edit and aborts. She says, "What's in the machines?" I said, "Well, they're cassette tapes." So I ejected the master, the original, and he held it, and she said, "That's not it." Took the second one out, and she said, "It's bad tape." And we checked it, and sure enough, there was a time code interruption, and it was right where I was making the edit. I put a new cassette in, made all the edits, went back to Capitol, and mastered off the digital. So that was my introduction to digital.
And to psychics.
I love it. And I never saw him again after that. I tried to find out. Nobody knows who he was.
Oh, you're joking.
It was a blessing.
Wow. Okay, well, that's insane. We'll just leave that where that dropped. That's incredible. So obviously, Jerry must have enjoyed working with you, because you only did another 124 films or something like that.
Hmm.
So were you, because at one point you became the engineer, or were you always just producing?
No, engineering.
Yeah, I thought so. So right away you became the engineer as well, or?
When we did Poltergeist, which was the first one after um, Star Trek, we did it at MGM, and even though I was a member of IATSE, I wasn't allowed to touch the console because in those days the stages didn't allow outside mixers.
Right.
And so I brought M50 microphones, Neumann M50s, and they had a great collection of tube mics, which were based on, I can't remember the guy that invented them, with the capsule from the U-47. So you had basically a lot of U-47s and the M50s. And we set it up, and it worked great. And Lyle Burbridge, who was the head of the sound department, was also the mixer. And Lyle was great. You know, he was really a sweetheart, and he relied on me to get the balance and, tell him what, do a little more of this, and it worked. And during this, because it was Steven Spielberg movie, John Williams came down, and they were about to do this film E.T. because Steven didn't want to go back to Fox anymore to score for reasons I don't know. And his offices were there on the lot at MGM. So John liked what he heard and what he saw, and he asked me to do E.T. the same way. So, and then the next movie after that was Twilight Zone.
Right.
And I did that at Warner's, and I engineered that. And from that point on, I engineered all the movies.
Right.
Recorded all, and produced a lot of the scores simultaneously.
And is that the only time you worked with John Williams, or did you work with him again?
I did after that score, which was the Temple of Doom.
Right.
I recorded it. And at that point, Lyle had worked it out so that I could work on the stage.
It's big of him, isn't it? But
Well,
still, no, that stuff is still,
It was like that at Capitol when I went up.
Well, look, it's still like that at the
there.
BBC. I've sat behind people many, many times saying, "Can you turn that hi-hat down, please?" So yeah, it's a thing. It's fine. So, but you're still making records while you're doing the scores, or did you sort of transition for a little while? Because I'd imagine, it's not the most time-consuming thing, because you're not composing the score, and the recording of the scores generally goes relatively quickly, and then you compile the albums, and you're off to another thing. So, did it slow down for making records, or were you just doing everything?
No, when I did Star Trek and started, was going to move into Poltergeist and everything, I started to enjoy it because, again, it was live. I wasn't doing a lot of overdubs. I wasn't getting, forgive me, all the artists that I work with, but getting phone calls at 4:00 in the morning when they were whacked out of their minds, and having to deal hold their hands and all that.
And this is, of course, right when really long albums is becoming a thing.
And I got a little fatigued by it, and the movie thing just came into my life. I was back to the red light went on. We recorded live, got a live mix, went home at night. It was great. So, I basically didn't do any album recording for quite a while.
Right. Well, and you worked on some big movies. LA Confidential, Basic Instinct, Poltergeist. We already talked about The Omen. And we have to mention Caddyshack, because that fits right in with the rest of them.
I love that. I love watching the movie still to this day.
It's fantastic. And I can't, to be honest, I don't even really remember what the score was like on that, but it obviously worked really well.
I didn't do the score. All I did was the songs.
Oh, right. Okay.
And that was how my beginning. No, that wasn't the beginning with me and Kenny Loggins. But but that was a beginning, real beginning. I used both Rick Baconen and Andy Johns on various recordings that I did with Kenny, because Kenny needed a full-time producer sitting there.
Right.
Not telling him what to do, but just saying that's good. Or, or saying, don't go past that. You're fine.
Right. Andy Johns doesn't seem like the natural fit for Kenny. I mean, I only worked on one record with Kenny, but like personality-wise, was that totally fine?
Oh, yeah. Kenny loved people.
Yeah,
Kenny was great.
But I'm saying Andy was, I mean, he's a presence. So it's...
Yeah, but you wanted that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that almost any recording, you're in that chair, that position, either producing, mixing, or composing, or the artist, for a reason, because you've got that head. And that's why people come to you for that.
Right.
You got that vision. And I mean, my whole thing has been that I get paid for having a good time. It's still my hobby.
Right. And you've also, I mean, we talked about, obviously, about the records. You were a staff producer. You started your own label at a very tender age, all the film work, but you've also done quite a bit of mastering of your own project, all these box sets. And also now you're doing the Atmos. You did 5.1 and now the Atmos and the Sony 360 and Pono. Yeah, absolutely.
Neil, if you're watching.
Yeah, you still got the hats. You can't get the units so much. But
I have a lot of units. Still have units, and they're still the coolest high resolution player out there. They gave you balanced audio out.
Yeah. And
you could put anything on it. We tried to make it so you couldn't play an MP3, but that didn't work.
Yeah. Well, we can go down that rabbit hole a little bit, but then that gets super technical. But so what I'm wondering is, did you, because like I'm a horrible case of imposter syndrome where I'm going to get found out any minute and, that sort of thing. And it helps drive me. I'm not going to pretend it's just a negative thing, but whatever. But you don't seem to ever have a problem stepping into a role you have never been in before and just doing it, and in a really high profile way. Like, absolutely, not only will I be in charge of this score, but I will be there at the scoring dates and I will record it to a format that we can't even edit, even though I know we have to edit it. And this never, I mean, imagine at some point you're having a sleepless night, but your response to it is to go to Musso and Frank's. That's pretty cool. Like, do you ever feel like you're winging it, or do you just know because of the way you hear that you will get it to come out of the speakers the way it's supposed to, and no one's going to do it better than you, and you're just going to do it?
I think I'm just plain stupid.
I don't know about that.
I like it. I like the challenge. I like going to places that people don't go. I like figuring out things.
And it seems as though you really don't mind the chaos, too. Like taking a band like The Doors, it's going to be a huge, high-profile record. They're leaving their longtime producer and like, yeah, we'll go to your rehearsal room. Yeah, MC5, sure, we'll cut that live. Like, just absolutely fearless about it. Yeah, well,
why not?
Why not?
As FDR said, the only fear we have to fear is fear itself.
Yeah, well, I do that. That's what I do, I think. Yeah,
I have my moments. I mean, especially like putting this Morrison Hotel box together. It took me about 3 months to figure it out. And I was at one point, I was really, my wife will tell you that I came home and I was really in a deep funk because I couldn't see it.
Right.
But then I did.
Yeah, but I mean, it's one thing to not see it when it's just you, but you'll go in to some pretty high profile situations with a ton of people where it's not like, yeah, we'll spend a month sorting this out. Like, it's going to have to happen right away. And it's just amazing how you do it. And it's also, I think, it's not just that everything I've heard that you've done, which is a lot, especially in the last week or so, captures the music amazingly well. Like, the spirit of the music is there, but a lot of it, in fact, I can't think of anything that I heard where it's like, well, maybe that doesn't sound amazing, but it still feels great. It all sounds amazing. Even that MC5 stuff, which, like, dude, it's crazy what is going on that record. But it is one of the most powerful live records I've ever heard. It's insane.
As we always like to say, it's 99% out in the room. 1% us.
Yeah, but you got to capture it, and you got to know what you're going after. So it's
that's true. I mean, the goal for me is to be invisible, to capture the moment and realize it now. I hear it in my head. I mean, there's no saying that I see the same color red that you do. I think that you and Al and everybody that's doing this, or George, hear it a certain way that people relate to. It's good fortune.
Very. So is there anything you feel like, I mean, there's so many things we haven't talked about, but is there anything like gigantic that we completely missed here?
I don't know. We were kind of like a ping pong ball, going back and forth.
I know.
So,
and like I say, I try to structure these things so that I know we're pulling all the threads, but you keep going off in these directions, and it's like, well, you can't just talk about one thing there. You got to go down that road. And I mean, we didn't really talk about like being a staff producer for Columbia, sort of how that happened and what that meant to your career, as opposed to just being freelance, even though you were at a label tied to,
Let's go back to Joe Wizard.
All right.
After Earth, Wind and Fire.
Yeah, which we've only mentioned offhand, by the way.
Yeah, we did that up at Caribou Ranch. Same place that I did Billy Joel's Turnstile album.
Yeah, we didn't mention him either.
Yeah, but that's okay. Billy's wonderful. Don't get me wrong. When I don't know how it happened, but Joe was a big supporter of mine. And he was a staff producer there. And he mentioned to Don Ellis and to Michael Dilbeck that they needed to have me. And this is why, the artists that I work with. And so they asked me if I want to be a staff producer. And I had never been a staff producer for a label. I've been an engineer. I only worked for 2 other companies before that. One was Sunset Sound, the other was Elektra Records. And so I got this gig there. And it was the coolest thing you can imagine. What a great family to be part of a record company in those days. I mean, the record company used to sign, like Elektra, sign an artist 2-3 album deal with the realization that nothing may happen until the 3rd album.
Right.
But it was worth the investment in the artist because you believed in the artist and the music. They did that at Columbia. And Don Ellis was just magnificent when it came to that ethos.
And what year are we talking here?
So we're talking about, I started there in 75.
Right.
I was 75 to 80. And they really treated me well. And the first convention that CBS had that I attended as an actual part of the company was in LA. Because they had them every year in different places, like in London, wherever. And we're at Royce Hall, and it's full. I mean, everybody was there. A&R, marketing, promotion, art department, foreign. I mean, everybody was there. We're all there, and they introduced William S. Paley, who's at that time still owned the company. He came out on the stage. I mean, this shows you what it felt like to be there. He came out on the stage, thunderous applause, and he says, I just want to tell you that I'm really depressed. I'm really downbeat right now. And all of a sudden you heard the room, a couple thousand people go, oh. He says, this is the first year that the record division has out-earned broadcast And the place went berserk. Then you left the stage. And then to show you, I mean, these were the great days. They said, we got back to our meetings, they said, here's an American Express card. It's got $10,000 on it. You're expected to take care of your artist, do what you need to do. And if you run out, we'll fill it up again. So it was like, this is
amazing.
Yeah, amazing. But a wonderful time. Great group of people. Incredibly collaborative. I really, between that and the movie industry, I truly understood the meaning of collaboration.
Right.
Because we're not an island to ourselves. And as my mother used to say, be a good listener.
And I think collaboration is definitely, you know, you talk about how few records are sort of cut live and things like that, but there's also a lot less collaboration. I mean, even major labels and big bands deliver their records now. That's it. They go off and they make them, and maybe they get a budget, but usually they get reimbursed afterwards. Like, I've worked on very few records where there's a real collaboration between the label. I mean, there are still some, but it's not as much, and that was just the way it was.
To give you a good example, when I did the Eddie Money record, the first album, I had Baby Hold On and 2 Tickets to Paradise. I could fly to New York and go to the building, Black Rock, and go to New York and play it for the promotion meetings and marketing. And I did that. And it was called Working the Building. You go in there and take your music, play for them, get them excited. So when it finally did come, they were excited. They had already laid the groundwork to get it on the radio. I remember billboards were in vogue, which Jack Holzman started, with the Doors. And I didn't see any marketing plan of any note for Eddie. And I went to the marketing department. I said, I was complaining about it. I said, can we give him a billboard on Sunset Strip? And they did. And then the promotion happened, and, it happened. It's not because of me. I mean, it was the music, but it was to be able to work the building and collaborate with the people. And I loved it.
Right. So what are a few other sort of notables from records you made while you were staff producer?
Cal Jam 2.
Right.
I love that one. Steve Perry, the Kenny Loggins records.
Right. Okay. And were you locked up to them? Like, you couldn't go off and make a record for somebody else at that point, right? While you're staff.
Yeah. Well, I did get a couple of calls, and I demurred, and then went and told Don Ellis about it. And he said, why did you do that? That's a big artist. It just helps your cred here. And I was like, oh, okay, thanks.
Wow. But that's a pretty progressive view on that stuff. That's amazing.
Well, they were, that's the way they were.
Yeah.
And I know it was like that at Warner Brothers too.
So the only thing it seems that you haven't done a lot of, and maybe I'm just wrong, is did you discover acts really?
No.
Never really did that. Never like found a band you loved and made a record and then shopped it, and nothing like that.
No, I didn't go to clubs because I was in the studio.
Right.
I was making music for the Summer of Love and during that whole period, and I never went to clubs.
Right.
Maybe 2.
2. Just
and
the
it was
2.
always the whiskey,
Right. Well, because it was just down the street.
Well, I did go to the Avalon Ballroom because an airplane flight to San Francisco was $7.25 each way. So I would fly up, see some gigs, and fly back that night.
Wow. That's all right.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, should we take some questions from
Please.
the peeps? Mark, come on
I'm
in.
hoarse. Mark?
Oh, he's coming.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello.
This has been amazing. Martin in the chat room just put in that it seems to him that if we were listening in an auditorium, we could hear a needle drop because everybody's just glued to the broadcast and listening to you guys.
Oh, thank
There hasn't
you.
been a
It's
ton
wonderful.
of, not a ton of like chat in the chat room because everybody's just engaged, but everybody's still in there. It's pretty funny. Cool. So we have a bunch of questions here, and we'll start off with the most voted one. So this one comes from Sam, and he says, "Hey Bruce, Bluebird is one of my favorite recordings of all time. Any insight on recording that? The acoustic guitars are unbelievable." And he's wondering, how did you get those hits to jump out of the speakers like that at the end of the verse?
Well, we did it at Sunset Sound, and I had Steven in the vocal booth, and I had a U47 on him, and as you can tell, it's compressed. The needle is just like that. And I couldn't have done it without the vocal booth because of the leakage of the drums. So as a consequence, I could work on a big drum sound to get those hits to happen.
Awesome. Nice. Okay, next question is coming from Lee Hudson, and he says, "Hi Bruce, could you tell me how many tracks were used on scoring the Star Trek motion picture and how big the studio was, etc.?"
Well, we scored Star Trek the motion picture at Fox. It was a little smaller than it is today because Ted Keep, who had been that I worked with at Liberty, he built a control room there where he did the Towering Inferno and Jaws.
Okay.
And so we did it on that stage, and we recorded 16 track. That's what we had. And live to 35 millimeter 6-track.
Awesome.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, he was asking how big the studio was as well.
The funny thing is it and MGM, which is now Sony, are the same size. It's just they're set up differently. At Fox, the orchestra would be facing you versus, well, it would be the same at MGM, but MGM used the lengthwise of the room to do the orchestra so that it was narrower front to back versus Fox, where everybody was kind of crammed in this way and very deep.
Right.
Excuse me for hiccuping.
And you're talking like 60 piece, 90 piece live. I mean, how many players?
90 to 110 and bigger. At Fox, they had a pipe organ,
right,
which was incredible.
And this is all with percussion live. I mean, this is everybody.
No overdubs.
Right.
Wow. Crazy. All right. Here is one from Alejandro, and he says, "Here's a cliche question for one or for both of you. What are your favorite plugins right now?"
You can go.
My favorite, well, I have two. The Massenburg equalizer. Actually, I have three, and his limiter compressor, and also the capital chambers that are available through the UA, and Universal Audio, because I love those echo chambers up there. I love room chambers. I mean, I cut my teeth on the one at Sunset Sound, which is also now available, and it's just a big difference. That my goal someday is to actually build another real acoustical chamber. You can't beat it.
So I saw in an interview you were talking about I can't remember his name right now, but a German guy who did his own IRs and like a totally different way of capturing the IR to get the electronics out of it and to really just capture the acoustic space. And I'm wondering, is that still something you use, or is that of a time and now things have caught up in the way people are capturing things? Because I mean, Altiverb, you've mentioned that a lot, so I think you use that. Okay. But what do you think of those IRs now?
They're really good, and he was, I think he was American.
Okay.
I'm not sure. I can't remember, but
This is what happens when I don't take notes.
his IRs, he somehow or another, he said he figured out a way to remove the electronics from the sound so that it truly represented the room, whatever reverberation it was. And I still go back and use them occasionally because they're really quite good. And the thing with a lot of digital reverbs, there's a lot of flutter in them. You can hear it because of the sampling, and his stuff was totally smooth. I wouldn't hear any chatter going down.
Right. The company's called Numerical Sound, just to...
Right. And I think he's still in business. I'm not sure.
Right.
They're quite good, and I used to use them through Altiverb. I still use Altiverb a lot today, especially in immersive audio to help create a space when there aren't a lot of instruments and make you feel like it's in the room with you.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Right. Do you need me to answer? Because I'm just going to say the one that I made.
Go for it.
Look, to be honest, I use the omni-channel plugin I made with Waves all day, every day, because I made it. So obviously I made the plugin I wanted for a channel strip. But other than that, I mean, Altiverb, I still use Dverb and SansAmp, two of the very early Pro Tools plugins, all the time. The UAD chambers I like a lot. I have good days and bad days with it. But I think the thing that has changed reverb for me, and I'm still no good at it, like I'm terrible at reverb, but when I was talking to Al a few weeks ago here, he was saying how he never uses just one reverb on a vocal. The way he gets those vocals to work is it's that chamber with a plate or with the Bricasti or with something else. And as soon as I started layering reverbs, it almost didn't even matter what they were. They all fill in each other's holes. And you get this sort of natural thing to them, which is counterintuitive to me. But
I mean, going back to the Doors, I always recorded reverb live on his vocal. And 9 times out of 10, it was an EMT, 140 plate. And I mean, I have 2 140s here that are beautiful. And then with the Sunset Chamber. So it's not uncommon to do that. And he's right.
Yeah, it completely transforms kind of the happy place my head goes to hearing it. Because it's not trying to be a thing anymore. It's just a space.
Yep. It's a visualization. Awesome. Next.
All right.
Thank you very next.
Cool. So Mark J asks, have you been able to translate the live energy you were discussing in the beginning of the interview into a multi-track recording in this day and age where musicians are either performing separately or in different locations?
You can kind of put them in the same space, but it doesn't mean that performance-wise or emotionally they are in the same space. Because there's something about playing live with one another that you're pulling. It's like going to a movie theater to see a movie with a crowd of people, and that emotion, let's say if a horror movie or something happens or something beautiful and brings you to, tears to your eyes. So it's yes, I've done lots of overdubbing. I've even done things where we're recording the strings at Abbey Road and we're here and put them together. In today's age, you can do almost anything. It's what you do with it afterwards. A lot of repurposing sometimes. Electronics are basically two-dimensional, one-dimensional in a lot of cases. And if you can put them into the same exact space, let's say Abbey Road Studio One or MGM or Fox, put it into the same room and remic it, bring it back, then it lives in the same space. May not emotionally be in the same space, but physically, acoustically or in your ear.
Yeah, I think it's where, for me, like in Altiverb, a lot of the recording studio short ambience programs really comes into it, where if I put a little bit of that on the drum kit and the vocal, then all of a sudden you've just built a construct for things to live
Right.
in. But
You've created a little leakage.
yeah, it definitely helps. But I mean, look, that history is littered with examples of bands that just couldn't make it happen without the crowd. Like you're talking about MC5, that was not going to happen in the studio. The first Rage record, they worked on that for a long time, and then they brought in all their buddies and cut the entire record live in front of some friends. And certain musicians in certain situations have to have that interaction, and it could just be between themselves, which is why whenever possible I'll make the singer sing along with every single take, because it's the singer's reaction in the outro of the song that makes everybody say that was the one, not the drum fill. So yeah, as much as you can with certain situations you do it, but there are obviously lots of mixing tricks to make it sound that way later. But
Can I go back to something? When you were asking me about producers influencing, one of the things that artists hate, if you ask them, they'll tell you, they hate being in a studio. And not because they hate being in studio, they just hate the fact that we're on the other side of a piece of glass, quite a distance from them, and the button hits, a voice in their head, you know? When I was mixing LA Woman, during that period, I also did a Randy Newman recording. And we did it out, and this is Poppy Studios. In their control room, it was floor to ceiling glass, 30 feet wide. So there was no separation between you and the room. So an artist felt immediately comfortable because you weren't in this fishbowl, and they weren't. And Tommy LaPuma realized that early on, and I'm sure that Al mentioned it, but he would sit out in the studio with the artist during the recording and with headphones and be with them. And it was much nicer. I wish I had learned that earlier on.
Yeah. Well, and famously, you know, like Daniel Lanois, most of the studios he's built don't have control rooms because he's just out there and there's a baffle. And I've made a couple of records like that, and it's been great. It's been really, really great. And sometimes for separation, you know, you got to do certain things. But I've had my studio at home in LA had a gigantic control room and a very small room that was good. It was good for drums, but only the drummer could be out there. And made a lot of records where everyone except the drummer's in the control room with the speakers cranked, and there are no headphones, no nothing. And other than the drummer getting completely forgotten because you'd start talking and you wouldn't hit the talkback button. But, you know, that interaction, it also, I think it just puts them at ease. So that's why they play better as well. Not wearing headphones is great for musicians.
Well, I mean, when I first started, I mean, up until the Doors, and I did it even with the Doors, we used loudspeakers to overdub too. We didn't use headphones.
Yeah, and with mic technique and speaker placement, there's not a lot of bleed. You can really minimize that stuff. And what little bleed there is, it's the bleed of the thing they're singing to, so it's fine. Like, who cares?
Yeah, and you know what? They have an easier time of staying on pitch and in tune, because headphones, we're not used to listening like this, like that. We're used to listening through the vibration. So if you're singing and you hear yourself naturally, you're going to be in tune.
Yeah.
That was another thing we discovered. We did that with Kenny Loggins on a High Adventure album. Put him on a loudspeaker, and it was much easier for him.
Right.
Amazing. Great tips. Okay, so we have one more question that's in that same vein. And this is Dan asking, do you have any advice on how to creatively approach today's scenario where we literally can't get together to record? So we're recording in our homes and collaborating with people far away. Anything to help, you know, maybe inspire each other to create better records together when you're working remote?
I mean, that's a really hard one, because I look at some of the Zoom calls where supposedly there's, you know, a bunch of musicians, all in their individual things recording, and I wonder how they're recording them and whether they're giving those files and
Yeah.
syncing them up after the fact.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there are a couple of systems which try and do better, but as soon as you hit the internet, there's latency and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, well, then you bring those files in afterwards and try and synchronize them and then repurpose them in a room or an environment. But, you know, if it's a bunch of people playing together at the same time, maybe you capture the moment. I mean, you know, the emotion and the performance.
I mean, I think there are things, I've actually given this a lot of thought, and I don't know if this would work, but if you're working with, let's say, 4 or 5 musicians, you could, using like streaming your audio, you could have one person who's like, let's say the drummer doesn't get to hear anybody, poor guy, but the drums are being listened to by the bass player. Then the drums and bass gets listened to by the guitar player, and then everything gets listened to by the vocalist. You could actually do it while on a Zoom call, and the latency would be okay because you just get all the files from where the vocalist got them, and that would all be fine, and you can sync it back up. But there's no way to get 2 ways. 2 people can't listen to each other and get rid of the latency. It's impossible. But if you're going to do it and you're just going to do it as a remote overdub, try doing it with speakers. Just take the headphones off. I mean, every time you see these things, everybody's wearing headphones, and you don't.
Yeah.
Obviously, with Zoom, with the echo cancellation and stuff, you do, because it'll start to feed back like crazy. But if you're just at home recording, just in general, try working on speakers. You know.
I agree. I agree. And for those of you out there that are doing recording at home and are using samples, do yourself a favor and play that sample out into maybe your living room, maybe there's a piano out there, a hallway, and bring a mic back in and mix those things together and get some 3-dimensionality to your sound. You know, and then if you do that with a bunch of different things, then they're in the same environment. I mean, it's stuff that when I was teaching, the kids would ask me, what do? I do all this in my bedroom. How do I get it to be more than just flat? Well, do something with it. Get it out of your bedroom.
Yeah. Yeah, you're
That's
not
what
trying
we
to
do.
build a
We got
reverb
it out of our
chamber.
bedrooms.
It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be amazing sounding. It just has to be some air. Yeah.
Right.
That's probably the big thing to remember, right? Because you hear something like that, and then it's, well, I'm in a bedroom. Is it really going to be better? And better is not really the point.
No. I mean,
That's
look, if you stand a mattress up in the corner of your bedroom, it's no longer a rectangle. So now it might sound okay. You know?
Right.
Who knows?
There have been a couple of Grammy-winning records out there, music, songs out there lately, big sellers that were done in people's bedrooms. So
Yeah. I mean, you know, and specifically the Billie Eilish record, which I think is amazing. It's musically, it's not my thing, but it is a great record done by people who knew what they wanted to hear.
There it is.
next,
Cool.
Anything-
Okay. Tony asks, it says, hi, Bruce. I'm a composer, mixer, film, etc. And I'm looking to switch to composing in surround instead of stereo, and also mixing in surround. My current hardware limitations are running a quad setup, and I was wondering if you have advice on how to make that work. Many thanks.
As you're composing, visualize your score. If you want to do it for surround, visualize things coming out of it. And especially on the screen with a movie, you don't want to distract from that rectangle up there in front of you, which has all the director's vision. You know, the music is to enhance, also to be invisible, but to enhance the emotion of the scene. So, but visualize where you want things to go. That's the best advice I can give you.
And
That's
hardware-wise, if you can get a trial of the Dolby renderer, and it'll run on the same machine as Pro Tools. There's great setup videos for Logic, Pro Tools, Cubase. You can get it going with anything. And their binaural representation, it depends on how good you are at acoustic cues. Like I'm bad at it and some people are better, but you can start to build surround in binaural and then take it out to speakers. And it's a way to start and have a starting point without deciding, well, I got to go out and buy 12 speakers and a monitor controller. And because you're into the, tens of thousands to get a setup where you can actually do Atmos. But you can mess with it on a much, much smaller scale.
True.
That's great advice.
I mean, in this day and age right now, there are mixers here in town that, because they can't get into the studios because of COVID, are doing mixing basically with headphones.
Yeah.
Binaural with the renderer.
Yeah. And then you get behind some speakers for a bit, fix your mistakes, and then you get better at it. And then eventually you can put speakers on your ceiling.
Oh, look at this. Amazing.
Cool. One or two more? What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. This is a good one. This is from Martin. Martin says, "Hi, Bruce. Will you write a book? You've met so many artists, so it would be awesome."
My wife keeps telling me to do it. I mean, Al Schmidt did it.
Yeah.
She says he did it. You should do it. So I just have to, I don't know what it'll take to sit down and do it. I have no idea.
You know what? I talked to, Phil Brown, the English engineer. He's like the Forrest Gump of like 70s recording. He was on every single record as an assistant, whatever.
Does he like chocolate?
I don't know, actually. But like he did a day of overdubs when they were putting together the Stairway to Heaven guitar solo. And then, whatever. But he produced the Talk records, et cetera, et cetera. But when he was getting ready to write a book, what he did was he sort of broke the book up into chapters. He said, I'll talk about other things, but these are the records that are going to kind of define the structure of the book. And he would just listen to the records over and over for a week while he was writing, and everything would just come flooding back to him. Things he'd forgotten and things. I mean, obviously with the Doors stuff, you've gone through the archives and all the outtakes, so you've got a lot of extra info. But that's how he got all that stuff to kind of resurface. It was an interesting approach.
I don't know about you, but when I finish an album or a movie, it's gone.
Oh yeah, yep, absolutely.
Because otherwise, I'm not open to what's coming. You asked me earlier, the next challenge.
Yeah, but I'm sure if you listen to especially some of the stuff you haven't really listened to in a while, it'll come back. So we all look forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Yes.
I look forward to reading it too. My wife does.
All right, so I have one more question from an up and coming mixing engineer. He's done a couple things that are doing pretty good. His name is Frank Filippetti, and he says, "Hi, Bruce. Great interview.
Hi, Frankie.
I love those M2s. What are you using for height channels?"
Oh,
which probably
Frank, on the ceiling, I'm using M7s, M7s, 708s to be exact, and still on the sides. Where is it? Oh yeah, there it is. A B&W 802s and 801s in the back.
Wow.
So it's kind of full rangey, but I wanted the ceiling to have acoustically the same imaging as the M2s, sonically.
And that's a lot of speakers up top, but that's because of the Sony format, or?
Well, there's 7 loudspeakers on the ceiling.
Right.
And the cool thing about the Sony format is that it's allowed me to use those front speakers in the Atmos as well to do 761 format. But the Sony format is quite interesting. It makes the image quite tall. You can make it very tall.
Because you've got LCR floor level, mid, and top, right?
Right. I'm only running 2 on the floor.
So Phantom Center.
The mids, which are the M2s, and then the 802s, 807s on the ceiling.
Wow. And no problem mix and matching the JBLs with the B&Ws. It's all good.
No. Well, one of the reasons is that I brought Dolby up and they tuned the room. Because I
Nice.
still do a fair amount of cinema, and it's a modified Dolby X curve that I use. And it's to the point where if what's coming through the speaker isn't flattering, it isn't.
Right. Fair enough. Did Andy Potvin come up there, or did you get someone else? Do you know Andy Potvin at Dolby? Just curious if you've dealt with him.
No. It was Brian Thompson.
Right. Okay.
I mean, Brian Pennington. Brian Pennington.
Right. Excellent.
And, yeah, it's an interesting process of EQing, and the crown amplifier that I'm using to drive these speakers, except for the ones on the floor, the big ones, the M2s, are all out of a crown amplifier that has the curve for that loudspeaker
Right.
built in. So then you EQ from that.
Right. Right. And it's one of the multi-channel crown amps, right?
It's 8 channels of 300 watts.
Right. Amazing. There you have it.
Fantastic.
All right. Well, Mr. Filippetti, was it? We look forward to big things out of you.
Yeah.
Watching very closely.
If we're kind of, now I'm sure there are plenty of questions, but I have a question for Andrew.
All right.
Andrew, how did you achieve the compression on that Metallica album? And that to get that, the big thing with me is I like to use overall compression at various stages. I like to use different sets of limiters set up to catch the quick stuff and the RMS, the peak and the RMS. And the meters are barely moving, but I'm getting about 4 to 6 dB more apparent level.
Yeah.
Because of it. So.
Well, in that record, there wasn't anything special. It just got pushed further than a lot of other records. And that's a whole thing which, this is the internet, so obviously this will go nowhere. I'm not going to name names, I'm not going to talk about things. There are many different versions that ended up out in the world. And some of the versions ended up going with the pre-mastering version. Some of them so there's like a whole litany of things, and it's hard to talk about that record as a whole. But if you just buy the record, that's obviously the mastered version of the mixes that we did. But my general approach, and I'm starting to back away from this recently, was almost no direct compression on anything ever. No insert compression on anything. I believe I was still using a 33609, 2264s that were in my console were the bus compressors, but very fast release, 100 millisecond, like as fast as you could make them go. So slowest attack, fastest release. And that was it on the bus. But parallel compression for days. So for me, the way, rather than bring the peaks down, the peaks just live all the way through to the end of the mix, but the RMS has come up to meet them like crazy. So that's where the dynamic range goes away, is by crushing things and then blending in lots of parallel. And that record was just a case of Greg Fidelman and I both lots of times said, this is starting to, because he was on an API, which takes gain in a totally different way than the Neve did as well. And we had like different problems as we were trying to do this, and we would keep backing off level, and we would just get mixed notes like, it lost something. What's going on? Put it back up that 0.6 dB. We'd managed to pull the stereo bus down, and there it was again. So it was just on the edge. And I think this is, for me, it's the sort of explanation a little bit about what it is about analog gear that I'm now completely over, but is the magic of it is you cannot control it. You get things, but other stuff comes along with it. You can't separate the harmonic distortion from the image collapsing or the clipping or whatever. It's all part and parcel of everything. So on that particular record, it was just more of everything. But to be completely honest, the Adele record, exactly the same setup. Exactly the same setup. A little bit more EQ on Metallica, because Adele, I barely EQ'd anything. Same parallel compression, just more of it.
Well, it worked.
Yeah, I got death threats. Some people didn't like it so much, but
Yeah,
that's
sort of a running question about it, because I mean, I've been to mixes with acts, representing the record company, where they've got 48 tracks or more, and each one has been smashed. And then they bring it up into a stereo bus, which is compressed again, and then they output going to the 2-track, compress it again. And so by the time they get done, the meter's just sitting there like this. And
Yeah.
it really doesn't have any punch. It's either loud or soft. And it's the same. It doesn't change. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's a crutch.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
there's certain records, like, I mean, I would point to the Skrillex stuff. That stuff is just a square wave, but it's some of the most exciting stuff you'll hear, especially in that genre. The bass drops are insane, and there are dynamics within it, but it's a square wave. So it can happen anyway. And like I said at the beginning, I'm really trying to kind of move away from it. I'm using a lot less parallel compression. My last few records I've mixed are probably 6 dB quieter than anything I've done in 15 years. But it's just because sonically I'm starting to not like what's happening. It's not because I've finally given in to everybody telling me my stuff's too loud. Like, I know it's too loud. But also, you don't have to master it. Like, you get mastering for free. So yeah, it's tough. But that record was just all about, it didn't feel right until it was exploding the bus. And there's no way to back off that later.
Yeah. No, that's good. It's an icon for the time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm on record as having won the loudness war, right? It's over.
I know.
So it's done. I think
We need to see about an actual entry in the Guinness Book for that.
No, that's still the band from Hitchhiker's Guide that you had to listen to in a bunker on the next planet.
Oh,
God, what were they called? It's a brilliant band name, too. Anyway.
Well, you know the secret of life, don't you?
Well, the answer, 42.
And this is where the broadcast cuts. Yeah.
42.
42. I think we should leave it there. What do you say?
Yeah.
Awesome,
I think
Bruce.
we're good. We've done...
yeah, we're at 3 hours. I told you, it just happens that way. And again, there's a million things we didn't talk about, but everything we talked about was incredible. So thank you so much for this. This is really great.
I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank everybody out there in Radio Land for listening and watching.
And like with that certain young Mr. Filippetti, we've got a guy on next week that I'm really hoping can break through. A Mr. Dave Pensado, I believe, will be on next week. So hopefully, he'll have some stuff to talk about. We'll see, up and comer.
I'll have to look him up.
Yeah, exactly.
All
So
right.
everybody, you got a week. And go back through this one, and every name that got mentioned that you don't know, go look it up, because there just wasn't time to explain everything. But yeah, incredible. Yeah. So that's it. I'm going to go to the thanks for watching graphic and mute our microphone, and then we're out of here for another week. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for doing this.
And thanks, Bruce.
Thank you.